Book 1. Paris Studied in its Atom. Chapter 1. Parvulus. Paris has a child, and the forest has a bird. The bird is called the sparrow. The child is called the gamin. Couple these two ideas, which contain the one all the furnace, the other all the dawn. Strike these two sparks together. Paris, childhood. There leaps out from them a little being. Homuncio, Plautus would say. This little being is joyous. He has not food every day, and he goes to the play every evening if he sees good. He has no shirt on his body, no shoes on his feet, no roof over his head. He is like the flies of heaven, who have none of these things. He is from 7 to 13 years of age. He lives in bands, roams the streets, lodges in the open air, wears an old pair of trousers of his father's, which descend below his heels, an old hat of some other father, which descends below his ears, a single suspender of yellow listing. He runs, lies in wait, rummages about, wastes time, blackens pipes, swears like a convict, haunts the wine shops, knows thieves, calls gay women thou, talks slang, sings obscene songs, and has no evil in his heart. This is because he has in his heart a pearl, innocence, and pearls are not to be dissolved in mud. So long as man is in his childhood, God wills that he shall be innocent. If one were to ask that enormous city, "What is this?" she would reply, "It is my little one." Chapter 2. Some of his particular characteristics. The gamin, the street Arab, of Paris is the dwarf of the giant. Let us not exaggerate. This cherub of the gutter sometimes has a shirt, but in that case he owns but one. He sometimes has shoes, but then they have no soles. He sometimes has a lodging, and he loves it, for he finds his mother there. But he prefers the street, because there he finds liberty. He has his own games, his own bits of mischief, whose foundations consists of hatred for the bourgeois, his peculiar metaphors, to be dead is to eat dandelions by the root, his own preoccupations, calling hackney coaches, letting down carriage steps, establishing means of transit between the two sides of a street in heavy rains, which he calls making the Bridge of Arts, crying discourses pronounced by the authorities in favor of the French people, cleaning out cracks in the pavement. He has his own coinage, which is composed of all the little morsels of worked copper which are found on the public streets. This curious money, which receives the name of loques, rags, has an invariable and well-regulated currency in this little bohemia of children. Lastly, he has his own fauna, which he observes attentively in the corners. The ladybird, the death's head plant louse, the daddy-long-legs, the devil, a black insect which menaces by twisting about its tail armed with 2 horns. He has his fabulous monster, which has scales under its belly but is not a lizard, which has pustules on its back but is not a toad, which inhabits the nooks of old lime kilns and wells that have run dry, which is black, hairy, sticky, which crawls sometimes slowly, sometimes rapidly, which has no cry, but which has a look, and is so terrible that no one has ever beheld it. He calls this monster the deaf thing. The search for these deaf things among the stones is a joy of formidable nature. Another pleasure consists in suddenly prying up a paving stone and taking a look at the woodlice. Each region of Paris is celebrated for the interesting treasures which are to be found there. There are earwigs in the timber yards of Ursuline. There are millipedes in the Pantheon. There are tadpoles in the ditches of the Champ du Mars. As far as sayings are concerned, this child has as many of them as Talleyrand. He is no less cynical, but he is more honest. He is endowed with a certain indescribable, unexpected joviality. He upsets the composure of the shopkeeper with his wild laughter. He ranges boldly from high comedy to farce. A funeral passes by. Among those who are accompanying the dead, there is a doctor. "Hey there!" shouts some street Arab. How long has it been customary for doctors to carry home their own work? Another is in a crowd, a grave man, adorned with spectacles and trinkets, turns round indignantly. You good-for-nothing, you have seized my wife's waist. Aye, sir, search me. Chapter 3. He is agreeable. In the evening, thanks to a few sous, which he always finds means to procure, the homuncio enters a theatre. On crossing that magic threshold, he becomes transfigured. He was the street Arab. He becomes the Titi. Theatres are a sort of ship turned upside down with the keel in the air. It is in that keel that the Titi huddles together. The Titi is to the gamin what the moth is to the larva, the same being endowed with wings and soaring. It suffices for him to be there, with his radiance and happiness, with his power of enthusiasm and joy, with his hand clapping, which resembles a clapping of wings, to confer on that narrow, dark, fetid, sordid, unhealthy, hideous, abominable keel the name of paradise. Bestow on an individual the useless and deprive him of the necessary, and you have the gamin. The gamin is not devoid of literary intuition. His tendency, as we say it with the proper amount of regret, would not constitute classic taste. He is not very academic by nature. Thus, to give an example, the popularity of Mademoiselle Mars among that little audience of stormy children was seasoned with a touch of irony. The gamin called her Mademoiselle Mouche. Hide yourself. This being bawls and scoffs and ridicules and fights, has rags like a baby and tatters like a philosopher, fishes in the sewer, hunts in the cesspool, extracts mirth from foulness, whips up the squares with his wit, grins and bites, whistles and sings, shouts and shrieks, tempers Alleluia with Montart de Lurette, chants every rhyme from the de profundis to the jack-pudding, finds without seeking, knows what he is ignorant of, is a Spartan to the point of thieving, is mad to wisdom, is lyrical to filth, would crouch down on Olympus, wallows in the dunghill and emerges from it covered with stars. The gamin of Paris is Rabelais in his youth. He is not content with his trousers unless they have a watch pocket. He is not easily astonished. He is still less easily terrified. He makes songs on superstitions. He takes the wind out of exaggerations. He twits mysteries. He thrusts out his tongue at ghosts. He takes the poetry out of stilted things. He introduces caricature into epic extravaganzas. It is not that he is prosaic, far from that, but he replaces the solemn vision by the farcical phantasmagoria. If Adamastor were to appear to him, the street Arab would say, "Hi there, bugaboo!" Chapter 4. He may be of use. Paris begins with the lounger and ends with the street Arab, two beings of which no other city is capable. The passive acceptance which contents itself with gazing, and the inexhaustible initiative, Prudhomme and Fouilleux. Paris alone has this in its natural history. The whole of the monarchy is contained in the lounger, the whole of anarchy in the gamin. This pale child of the Parisian faubourgs lives and develops, makes connections, grows supple in suffering, in the presence of social realities and of human things, a thoughtful witness. He thinks himself heedless, and he is not. He looks and is on the verge of laughter. He is on the verge of something else also. Whoever you may be, if your name is prejudice, abuse, ignorance, oppression, iniquity, despotism, injustice, fanaticism, tyranny, beware of the gaping gamin. The little fellow will grow up. Of what clay is he made? Of the first mud that comes to hand. A handful of dirt, a breath, and behold, Adam. It suffices for a god to pass by. A god has always passed over the street Arab. Fortune labors at this tiny being. By the word fortune we mean chance, to some extent. That pygmy kneaded out of common earth, ignorant, unlettered, giddy, vulgar, low. Will that become an Ionian or Boeotian? Wait. Curate Rota, the spirit of Paris, that demon which creates the children of chance and the men of destiny, reversing the process of the Latin potter, makes of a jug an amphora. End of Book 1, Chapters 1 through 4. Book 1, Paris Studied in its Atom. Chapter 5, His Frontiers. The gamin loves the city. He also loves solitude, since he has something of the sage in him. Urbis amator, like Fuscus, ruris amator, like Flaccus. To roam thoughtfully about, that is to say, to lounge, is a fine employment of time in the eyes of the philosopher, particularly in that rather illegitimate species of campaign, which is tolerably ugly, but odd and composed of two natures, which surrounds certain great cities, notably Paris. To study the suburbs is to study the amphibious animal. End of the trees, beginning of the roofs. End of the grass, beginning of the pavements. End of the furrows, beginning of the shops. End of the wheel ruts, beginning of the passions. End of the divine murmur, beginning of the human uproar. Hence an extraordinary interest. Hence, in these not very attractive places, indelibly stamped by the passing stroller with the epithet melancholy, the apparently objectless promenades of the dreamer. He who writes these lines has long been a prowler about the barriers of Paris, and it is for him a source of profound souvenirs. That close-shaven turf, those pebbly paths, that chalk, those pools, those harsh monotonies of waste and fallow lands, the plants of early market garden suddenly springing into sight in a bottom, that mixture of the savage and the citizen, those vast desert nooks where the garrison drums practice noisily, the produce, a sort of lisping of battle, those hermits by day and cutthroats by night, that clumsy mill which turns in the wind, the hoisting wheels of the quarries, the tea gardens at the corners of the cemeteries, the mysterious charm of great sombre walls, squarely intersecting immense vague stretches of land, inundated with sunshine and full of butterflies. All this attracted him. There is hardly anyone on earth who is not acquainted with those singular spots, the Glacière, the Cunette, the hideous wall of Grenelle, all speckled with balls, Montparnasse, the Fosse à Loup, Aubière on the bank of the Marne, Montsouris, the Doumissoir, the Pierre Plat de Chantillon, where there is an old exhausted quarry which no longer serves any purpose except to raise mushrooms, and which is closed on a level with the ground by a trap-door of rotten planks. The Campagna of Rome is one idea, the banlieue of Paris is another. To behold nothing but fields, houses, or trees in what a stretch of country offers us, is to remain on the surface. All aspects of things are thoughts of God. The spot where a plain effects its junction with the city is always stamped with a certain piercing melancholy. Nature and humanity both appeal to you at the same time there. Local originalities there make their appearance. Anyone who, like ourselves, has wandered about in these solitudes contiguous to our faubourgs, which may be designated as the limbos of Paris, has seen here and there, in the most desert spot, at the most unexpected moment, behind a meagre hedge or in this corner of a lugubrious wall, children grouped tumultuously, fetid, muddy, dusty, ragged, dishevelled, playing hide-and-seek, and crowned with cornflowers. All of them are little ones who have made their escape from poor families. The outer boulevard is their breathing space. The suburbs belong to them. There they are eternally playing truant. There they innocently sing their repertory of dirty songs. There they are, or rather there they exist, far from every eye, in the sweet light of May or June, kneeling round a hole in the ground, snapping marbles with their thumbs, quarrelling over half-farthings, irresponsible, volatile, free, and happy. And no sooner do they catch sight of you than they recollect that they have an industry, and that they must earn their living, and they offer to sell you an old woolen stocking filled with cockchafers or a bunch of lilacs. These encounters with strange children are one of the charming and at the same time poignant graces of the environs of Paris. Sometimes there are little girls among the throngs of boys, are they their sisters, who are almost young maidens, thin, feverish, with sunburnt hands, covered with freckles, crowned with poppies and ears of rye, gay, haggard, barefooted. They can be seen devouring cherries among the wheat. In the evening they can be heard laughing. These groups, warmly illuminated by the full glow of midday, or distinctly seen in the twilight, occupy the thoughtful man for a very long time, and these visions mingle with his dreams. Paris, center, banlieue, circumference. This constitutes all the earth to those children. They never venture beyond this. They can no more escape from the Parisian atmosphere than fish can escape from the water. For them, nothing exists 2 leagues beyond the barriers. Ivry, Chantilly, Arcturier, Bellevue, Abervière, Ménilmontant, Choisy-le-Roi, Briancourt, Mendon, Issy, Vanvray, Sèvres, Puteaux, Neuilly, Geneviève, Colombes, Romainville, Château, Asnières, Bougival, Nanterre, Enghien, Noisy-le-Sec, Nogent, Gournay, Drancy, Gonesse. The universe ends there. Chapter 6. A bit of history. At the epoch, nearly contemporary, by the way, when the action of this book takes place, there is not, as there is today, a policeman at the corner of every street, a benefit which there is no time to discuss here. Stray children abounded in Paris. The statistics give an average of 260 homeless children picked up annually at that period by the police patrols in unenclosed lands, in houses in process of construction, and under the arches of the bridges. One of these nests, which has become famous, produced the swallows of the bridge of Arcola. This is, moreover, the most disastrous of social symptoms. All crimes of the man begin in the vagabondage of the children. Let us make an exception in favor of Paris, nevertheless. In a relative measure, and in spite of the souvenir which we have just recalled, the exception is just. While in any other great city the vagabond child is a lost man, while nearly everywhere the child left to itself is, in some sort, sacrificed and abandoned to a kind of fatal immersion in the public vices which devour in him honesty and conscience, the street boy of Paris, we insist on this point, however defaced and injured on the surface, is almost intact on the interior. It is a magnificent thing to put on record, and one which shines forth in the splendid probity of our popular revolutions, that a certain incorruptibility results from the idea which exists in the air of Paris, as salt exists in the water of the ocean. To breathe Paris preserves the soul. What we have just said takes away nothing of the anguish of heart which one experiences every time that one meets one of these children, around whom one fancies that he beholds floating the threads of a broken family. In the civilization of the present day, incomplete as it still is, it is not a very abnormal thing to behold these fractured families pouring themselves out into the darkness, not knowing clearly what has become of their children, and allowing their own entrails to fall on the public highway. Hence these obscure destinies. This is called, for the sad thing has given rise to an expression, to be cast on the pavements of Paris. Let it be said, by the way, that this abandonment of children was not discouraged by the ancient monarchy. A little of Egypt and Bohemia and the lower regions suited the upper spheres, and compassed the aims of the powerful. The hatred of instruction for the children of the people was a dogma. What is the use of half-lights? Such was the countersign. Now, the erring child is the corollary of the ignorant child. Besides this, the monarchy sometimes was in need of children, and in that case it skimmed the streets. Under Louis XIV, not to go any further back, the king rightly desired to create a fleet. The idea was a good one, but let us consider the means. There can be no fleet if, beside the sailing ship, that plaything of the winds, and for the purpose of towing it, in case of necessity, there is not the vessel which goes where it pleases, either by means of oars or of steam. The galleys were then to the marine what steamers are today. Therefore galleys were necessary. But the galley is moved only by the galley slave. Hence, galley slaves were required. Colbert had the commissioners of provinces and the parliaments make as many convicts as possible. The magistracy showed a great deal of complaisance in that matter. A man kept his hat on in the presence of a procession. It was a Huguenot attitude. He was sent to the galleys. A child was encountered in the streets. Provided that he was 15 years of age and did not know where he was to sleep, he was sent to the galleys. Grand reign, grand century. Under Louis XV, children disappeared in Paris. The police carried them off for what mysterious purpose no one knew. People whispered with terror monstrous conjectures as to the king's baths of purple. Barbier speaks ingenuously of these things. It sometimes happened that the exempts of the guard, when they ran short of children, took those who had fathers. The fathers in despair attacked the exempts. In that case the Parliament intervened and had someone hung. Who? The exempts? No, the fathers. End of Book 1, Chapters 5 and 6.
Book 1st, Paris Studied in its Atom. Chapter 7. The gamin should have his place in the classifications of India. The body of street Arabs in Paris almost constitutes a caste. One might almost say, not everyone who wishes to belong to it can do so. This word gamin was printed for the first time and reached popular speech through the literary tongue in 1834. It is in a little work entitled Claude Gueux that this word made its first appearance. The horror was lively. The word passed into circulation. The elements which constitute the consideration of the gamin for each other are very various. We have known and associated with one who was greatly respected and vastly admired because he had seen a man fall from the top of the tower of Notre Dame. Another, because he had succeeded in making his way into the rear courtyard where the statues of the dome of the Invalides had been temporarily deposited, and had prigged some lead from them. A third, because he had seen a diligence tip over. Still another, because he knew a soldier who came near putting out the eye of a citizen. This explains that famous exclamation of a Parisian gamin, a profound epiphonema which the vulgar herd laughs at without comprehending. Dieu de Dieu, what ill luck I do have! To think that I have never yet seen anybody tumble from a 5th-story window! I have pronounced I have, and fifth pronounced fift. Surely this saying of a peasant is a fine one. Father so-and-so, your wife has died of her malady. Why did you not send for the doctor? What would you have, sir? We poor folks die of ourselves. But if the peasant's whole passivity lies in this saying, the whole of the free-thinking anarchy of the brat of the faubourg is, assuredly, contained in this other saying. A man condemned to death is listening to his confessor in the tumbrel. The child of Paris exclaims, "He is talking to his black cap! Oh, the sneak!" A certain audacity on matters of religion sets off the gamin. To be strong-minded is an important item. To be present at executions constitutes a duty. He shows himself at the guillotine, and he laughs. He calls it by all sorts of pet names. The end of the soup, the growler, the mother in the blue, the sky, the last mouthful, etc., etc. In order not to lose anything of the affair, he scales the walls, he hoists himself to balconies, he ascends trees, he suspends himself to gratings, he clings fast to chimneys. The gamin is born a tiler as he is born a mariner. A roof inspires him with no more fear than a mast. There is no festival which comes up to an execution on the Place de Grève. Samson and the Abbé Mont are the truly popular names. They hoot at the victim in order to encourage him. They sometimes admire him. Lacenaire, when a gamin, on seeing the hideous Dautin die bravely, uttered these words which contain a future. I was jealous of him. In the Brotherhood of Gamins, Voltaire is not known, but Papavoine is. Politicians are confused with assassins in the same legend. They have a tradition as to everybody's last garment. It is known that Tolleron had a fireman's cap, Avril an otter cap, Losvel a round hat, that old Delaporte was bald and bareheaded, that Castin was all ruddy and very handsome, that Bourri had a romantic small beard, that Jean Martin kept on his suspenders, that Lecouf and his mother quarreled. "Don't reproach each other for your basket," shouted a gamin to them. Another, in order to get a look at Debarcaire as he passed, and being too small in the crowd, caught sight of the lantern on the quay and climbed it. A gendarme stationed opposite frowned. "Let me climb up, monsieur le gendarme," said the gamin, and, to soften the heart of the authorities, he added, "I will not fall." "I don't care if you do," retorted the gendarme. In the brotherhood of gamins, a memorable accident counts for a great deal. One reaches the height of consideration if one chances to cut oneself very deeply, to the very bone. The fist is no mediocre element of respect. One of the things that the gamin is fondest of saying is, "I am fine and strong, come now." To be left-handed renders you very enviable. A squint is highly esteemed. Chapter 8, in which the reader will find a charming saying of the last king. In summer he metamorphoses himself into a frog, and in the evening, when night is falling, in front of the bridges of Austerlitz and Jena, from the tops of coal wagons and the washerwomen's boats, he hurls himself headlong into the Seine and into all possible infractions of the laws of modesty and of the police. Nevertheless, the police keep an eye on him, and the result is a highly dramatic situation which once gave rise to a fraternal and memorable cry. That cry, which was celebrated about 1830, is a strategic warning from gamin to gamin. It scans like a verse from Homer, with a notation as inexpressible as the Elysiac chant of the Panathenaea, and in it one encounters again the ancient Evo. Here it is. "Ohé! Titi! Ohé! Here comes the bobby! Here comes the police! Pick up your duds and be off! Through the sewer with you!" Sometimes this gnat, that is what he calls himself, knows how to read. Sometimes he knows how to write. He always knows how to daub. He does not hesitate to acquire, by no one knows what mysterious mutual instruction, all the talents which can be of use to the public. From 1815 to 1830, he imitated the cry of the turkey. From 1830 to 1848, he scrawled pears on the walls. One summer evening, when Louis Philippe was returning home on foot, he saw a little fellow, no higher than his knee, perspiring and climbing up to draw a gigantic pear in charcoal on one of the pillars of the gate of Neuilly. The king, with that good nature which came to him from Henry IV, helped the gamin, finished the pear, and gave the child a louis, saying, "The pear is on that also." The gamin loves uproar. A certain state of violence pleases him. He execrates the cures. One day, in the Rue de l'Université, one of these scamps was putting his thumb to his nose at the carriage gate of number 69. "Why are you doing that at the gate?" a passer-by asked. The boy replied, "There is a cure there." It was there, in fact, that the papal nuncio lived. Nevertheless, whatever may be the Voltairianism of this small gamin, if the occasion to become a chorister presents itself, it is quite possible that he will accept, and in that case he serves the Mass civilly. There are two things to which he plays Tantalus, and which he always desires without ever attaining them: to overthrow the government, and to get his trousers sewed up again. The gamin in his perfect state possesses all the policemen of Paris, and can always put the name to the face of any one which he chances to meet. He can tell them off on the tips of his fingers. He studies their habits, and he has special notes on each one of them. He reads the souls of the police like an open book. He will tell you fluently and without flinching, "Such an one is a traitor, such another is very malicious, such another is great, such another is ridiculous." All these words, traitor, malicious, great, ridiculous, have a particular meaning in his mouth. That one imagines that he owns the Pont Neuf, and he prevents people from walking on the cornice outside the parapet. That other has a mania for pulling persons' ears, etc., etc. Chapter 9. The Old Soul of Gaul. There was something of that boy in Poquelin, the son of the fish market. Beaumarchais had something of it. Gaminerie is a shade of the Gallic spirit. Mingled with good sense, it sometimes adds force to the latter, as alcohol does to wine. Sometimes it is a defect. Homer repeats himself eternally, granted. One may say that Voltaire plays the gamin. Camille Desmoulins was a native of the Faubourg. Championnet, who treated miracles brutally, rose from the pavements of Paris. He had, when a small lad, inundated the porticos of Saint-Jean-de-Beauvais and of Saint-Étienne-du-Mont. He had addressed the shrine of Sainte Geneviève familiarly to give orders to the file of Saint Januarius. The gamin of Paris is respectful, ironical, and insolent. He has villainous teeth because he is badly fed and his stomach suffers, and handsome eyes because he has wit. If Jehovah himself were present, he would go hopping up the steps of paradise on one foot. He is strong on boxing. All beliefs are possible to him. He plays in the gutter and straightens himself up with a revolt. His effrontery persists even in the presence of grape-shot. He was a scapegrace. He is a hero. Like the little Theban, he shakes the skin from the lion. Barra the drummer boy was a gamin of Paris. He shouts forward, as the horse of Scripture says, va, and in a moment he has passed from the small brat to the giant. This child of the puddle is also the child of the ideal. Measure that spread of wings which reaches from Molière to Barra. To sum up the whole, and in one word, the gamin is a being who amuses himself because he is unhappy. End of Book 1, Chapters 7 through 9.
Book First, Paris Studied in its Atom. Chapter 10, Ecce Paris, Ecce Homo. To sum it all up once more, the Paris gamin of today, like the Græculus of Rome in days gone by, is the infant populace with the wrinkle of the old world on his brow. The gamin is a grace to the nation, and at the same time a disease. A disease which must be cured how? By light. Light renders healthy. Light kindles. All generous social irradiations spring from science, letters, arts, education. Make men. Make men. Give them light that they may warm you. Sooner or later, the splendid question of universal education will present itself with the irresistible authority of the absolute truth. And then, those who govern under the superintendence of the French idea will have to make this choice. The children of France, or the gamins of Paris? Flames in the light, or will-o'-the-wisps in the gloom? The gamin expresses Paris, and Paris expresses the world. For Paris is a total. Paris is the ceiling of the human race. The whole of this prodigious city is a foreshortening of dead manners and living manners. He who sees Paris thinks he sees the bottom of all history, with heaven and constellations in the intervals. Paris has a capital, the town hall, a Parthenon, Notre Dame, a Mount Aventine, the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, an Asinarium, the Sorbonne, a Pantheon, the Pantheon, a Via Sacra, the Boulevard des Italiens, a Temple of the Winds, opinion, and it replaces the Gemoniae by ridicule. Its Majo is called Ferraud. Its transvestirin is the man of the faubourgs. Its Hamal is the market porter. Its Lazarone is the pègre. Its Cockney is the native of Ghent. Everything that exists elsewhere exists at Paris. The fish-woman of Dumarsais can retort on the herb-seller of Euripides. The disco-balls of Janus lives again in the Forioso, the tightrope dancer. Therapontagonus Miles could walk arm in arm with Vaudeboncourt the grenadier. Damasippus, the second-hand dealer, would be happy among bric-a-brac merchants. Vincennes could grasp Socrates in its fist as just as Agora could imprison Diderot. Grimaud de la Reynière discovered larded roast beef, as Curtillus invented roast hedgehog. We see the trapeze which figures in Plautus reappear under the vault of the Arc of l'Étoile. The sword-eater of Poiculus encountered by Opulius is a sword-swallower on the Pont Neuf. The nephew of Rameau and Curculio the parasite make a pair. Ergasilus could get himself presented to Cambyses by d'Agrafé. The four dandies of Rome, Alcasimarchus, Phodromus, Diabolus, and Argyrippus, descend from Curti in Labatut's posting chaise. Aulus Gellius would halt no longer in front of Congrio than would Charles Nodier in front of Puccinello. Marto is not a tigress, but Pardalisca was not a dragon. Pantolabus, the wag, jeers in the Café Anglais at Nomentanus, the fast liver. Hermogenes is a tenor in the Champs-Élysées, and round him Thracius the beggar, clad like Bobetche, takes up a collection. The boor who stops you by the button of your coat in the Tuileries makes you repeat after a lapse of 2,000 years Thesprion's apostrophe. Quis properantum me prehendit Palio. The wine on Cyrene is a parody of the wine of Alba. The red border of Desaugiers forms a balance to the great cutting of Balatro. Père Lachaise exhales beneath nocturnal rains some gleams at the Escoliae, and the grave of the poor, bought for 5 years, is certainly the equivalent of the slave's hived coffin. Seek something that Paris has not. The vat of Trophonius contains nothing that is not in Mesmer's tub. Ergaphilas lives again in Cagliostro. The Brahmin Vesiphanta becomes incarnate in the Comte de Saint-Germain. The cemetery of Saint-Médard works quite as good miracles as the mosque of Umumi at Damascus. Paris has an Aesop, Mailloux, and a Canidia, Mademoiselle Lenormand. It is terrified, like Delphos, at the fulgurating realities of the vision. It makes tables turn as Dodona did tripods. It places the grisette on the throne as Rome placed the courtesan there. And, taking it all together, if Louis XV is worse than Claudian, Madame du Barry is better than Messalina. Paris combines in an unprecedented type, which has existed and which we have elbowed, Grecian nudity, the Hebraic ulcer, and the Gascon pun. It mingles Diogenes, Job, and Jack Pudding, dresses up a spectre in old numbers of the Constitutional, and makes Chodruc Duclos. Although Plutarch says the tyrant never grows old, Rome, under Sylla as under Domitian, resigned itself and willingly put water in its wine. The Tiber was a Lethe, if the rather doctrinary eulogium made of it by Verus Fibiscus is to be credited. Contra Gracchus Tiberim habemus, bibere Tiberim, id est seditionem oblivisci. Paris drinks 1,000,000 liters of water a day, but that does not prevent it from occasionally beating the general alarm and ringing the tocsin. With that exception, Paris is amiable. It accepts everything royally. It's not too particular about its Venus. Its Callipyge is Hottentot. Provided that it is made to laugh, it condones. Ugliness cheers it. Deformity provokes it to laughter. Vice diverts it. Be eccentric, and you may be an eccentric. Even hypocrisy, that supreme cynicism, does not disgust it. It is so literary that it does not hold its nose before Basile, and is no more scandalized by the prayer of Tartuffe than Horace was repelled by the hiccup of Priapus. No trait of the universal face is lacking in the profile of Paris. The bal mobile is not the Polymnia dance of the Janiculum, but the dealer in ladies wearing apparel there devours the lorette with her eyes, exactly as the procuress Staphyla lay in wait for the virgin Planesium. The Barrière du Combat is not the Colosseum, but people are as ferocious there as though Caesar were looking on. The Syrian hostess has more grace than Mother Saguet, But if Virgil haunted the Roman wine-shop, David d'Angers, Balzac, and Charlet have sat at the tables of Parisian taverns. Paris reigns. Geniuses flash forth there. The red-tails prosper there. Adonai passes on his chariot with its 12 wheels of thunder and lightning. Silenus makes his entry there on his ass, for Silenus read Ramponneau. Paris is the synonym of cosmos. Paris is Athens, Sybaris, Jerusalem, Pontain. All civilizations are there in an abridged form. All barbarisms also. Paris would greatly regret it if it had not a guillotine. A little of the Place de Grève is a good thing. What would all that eternal festival be without this seasoning? Our laws are wisely provided, and thanks to them, the blade drips on this Shrove Tuesday. Chapter 11. To scoff, to reign. There's no limit to Paris. No city has had that domination which sometimes derides those whom it subjugates. To please you, O Athenians, exclaimed Alexander. Paris makes more than the law, it makes the fashion. Paris sets more than the fashion, it sets the routine. Paris may be stupid if it sees fit. It sometimes allows itself this luxury. Then the universe is stupid in company with it. Then Paris awakes, rubs its eyes, says, "How stupid I am," and bursts out laughing in the face of the human race. What a marvel is such a city! It is a strange thing that this grandioseness and this burlesque should be amicable neighbors, that all this majesty should not be thrown into disorder by all this parody, and that the same mouth can today blow into the trump of the judgment day, and tomorrow into the reed flute. Paris has a sovereign joviality. Its gaiety is of the thunder, and its farce holds a scepter. Its tempest sometimes proceeds from a grimace. Its explosions, its days, its masterpieces, its prodigies, its epics, go forth to the bounds of the universe, and so also do its cock and bull stories. Its laugh is the mouth of a volcano which spatters the whole earth. Its jests are sparks. It imposes its caricatures as well as its ideal on people. The highest monuments of human civilization accept its ironies and lend their eternity to its mischievous pranks. It is superb. It has a prodigious 14th of July, which delivers the globe. It forces all nations to take the oath of tennis. Its night of the 4th of August dissolves in 3 hours 1,000 years of feudalism. It makes of its logic the muscle of unanimous will. It multiplies itself under all sorts of forms of the sublime. It fills with its light Washington, Kosciuszko, Bolivar, Bozaris, Riego, Bem, Manin, Lopez, John Brown, Garibaldi. It is everywhere where the future is being lighted up. At Boston in 1779, at the Ile de Leon in 1820, at Pest in 1848, at Palermo in 1860. It whispers the mighty countersign, liberty, in the ear of the American abolitionists grouped about the boat at Harper's Ferry, and in the ear of the patriots of Ancona assembled in the shadow, to the Archai before the Gauzy Inn on the seashore. It creates Canary, it creates Quiroga, it creates Pisacan. It irradiates the great on earth. It was while proceeding whither its breath urged them that Byron perished at Missolonghi and that Mazet died at Barcelona. It is the tribune under the feet of Mirabeau and a crater under the feet of Robespierre. Its books, its theatre, its art, its science, its literature, its philosophy are the manuals of the human race. It has Pascal, Renier, Corneille, Descartes, Jean-Jacques, Voltaire for all moments, Molière for all centuries. It makes its language to be talked by the universal mouth, and that language becomes the word. It constructs in all minds the idea of progress. The liberating dogmas which it forges are for the generation's trusty friends, and it is with the soul of its thinkers and its poets that all heroes of all nations have been made since 1789. This does not prevent vagabondism, and that enormous genius which is called Paris, while transfiguring the world by its light, sketches in charcoal Bouginier's nose on the wall of the Temple of Theseus, and writes Crédville the thief on the pyramids. Paris is always showing its teeth. When it is not scolding, it is laughing. Such is Paris. The smoke of its roofs forms the ideas of the universe. A heap of mud and stone, if you will, but, above all, a moral being. It is more than great. It is immense. Why? Because it is daring. To dare, that is the price of progress. All sublime conquests are, more or less, the prizes of daring. In order that the revolution should take place, it does not suffice that Montesquieu should foresee it, that Diderot should preach it, that Beaumarchais should announce it, that Condorcet should calculate it, that Hérouet should prepare it, that Rousseau should premeditate it. It is necessary that Danton should dare it. The cry, audacity, is a fiat lux. It is necessary for the sake of the forward march of the human race that there should be proud lessons of courage permanently on the heights. Daring deeds dazzle history and are one of man's great sources of light. The dawn dares when it rises. To attempt, to brave, to persist, to persevere, to be faithful to oneself, to grasp fate bodily, to astound catastrophe by the small amount of fear that it occasions us, now to affront unjust power, again to insult drunken victory, to hold one's position, to stand one's ground. That is the example which nations need. That is the light which electrifies them. The same formidable lightning proceeds from the torch of Prometheus to Cambronne's short pipe. End of Book 1, Chapter 11. Recording by Adam Ringeth. Book 1st. Paris Studied in its Atom. Chapter 12. The Future Latent in the People. As for the Parisian populace, even when a man grown, it is always the street Arab. To paint the child is to paint the city, and it is for that reason that we have studied this eagle in this errant sparrow. It is in the faubourgs, above all, we maintain, that the Parisian race appears. There is the pure blood, there is the true physiognomy. There this people toils and suffering and toil are the two faces of man. There exist there immense numbers of unknown beings, among whom swarm types of the strangest, from the porter of La Rapée to the knacker of Montfaucon. Fex urbis, exclaims Cicero. Mob, adds Burke, indignantly. Rabble, multitude, populace. These are words and quickly uttered, but so be it. What does it matter? What is it to me if they do go barefoot? They do not know how to read. So much the worse. Would you abandon them for that? Would you turn their distress into a malediction? Cannot the light penetrate these masses? Let us return to that cry, light, and let us obstinately persist therein. Light, light. Who knows whether these opacities will not become transparent? Are not revolutions transfigurations? Come, philosophers, teach, enlighten, light up, think aloud, speak aloud, hasten joyously to the great sun, fraternize with the public place, announce the good news, spend your alphabets lavishly, proclaim rights, sing the Marselaises, sow enthusiasms, tear green boughs from the oaks. Make a whirlwind of the idea. This crowd may be rendered sublime. Let us learn how to make use of that vast conflagration of principles and virtues which sparkles, bursts forth, and quivers at certain hours. These bare feet, these bare arms, these rags, these ignorances, these abjectnesses, these darknesses, may be employed in the conquest of the ideal. Gaze past the people, and you will perceive truth. Let that vile sand which you trample underfoot be cast into the furnace. Let it melt and seethe there. It will become a splendid crystal, and it is thanks to it that Galileo and Newton will discover stars. Chapter 13. Little Gavroche. 8 or 9 years after the events narrated in the second part of this story, people noticed on the Boulevard du Temple and in the regions of the Château d'Eau a little boy 11 or 12 years of age, who would have realized with tolerable accuracy that ideal of the gamin sketched out above, if, with a laugh of his age on his lips, he had not had a heart absolutely sombre and empty. This child was well muffled up in a pair of man's trousers, but he did not get them from his father, and a woman's chemise, but he did not get it from his mother. Some people or other had clothed him in rags out of charity. Still, he had a father and a mother, but his father did not think of him, and his mother did not love him. He was one of those children most deserving of pity among all, one of those who have father and mother, and who are orphans nevertheless. This child never felt so well as when he was in the street. The pavements were less hard to him than his mother's heart. His parents had dispatched him into life with a kick. He simply took flight. He was a boisterous, pallid, nimble, wide-awake, jeering lad, with a vivacious but sickly air. He went and came, sang, played at hopscotch, scraped the gutters, stole a little, but, like cats and sparrows, gaily laughed when he was called a rogue, and got angry when called a thief. He had no shelter, no bread, no fire, no love. But he was merry because he was free. When these poor creatures grow to be men, the millstones of the social order meet them and crush them. But so long as they are children, they escape because of their smallness. The tiniest hole saves them. Nevertheless, abandoned as this child was, it sometimes happened, every 2 or 3 months, that he said, "Come, I'll go and see Mamma." Then he quitted the boulevard, the Cirque, the Porte Saint-Martin, descended to the quays, crossed the bridges, reached the suburbs, arrived at the Salpêtrière, and came to a halt. Where? Precisely at that double number, 5052, with which the reader is acquainted, at the Gorbeau hovel. At that epoch, the hovel 5052, generally deserted and eternally decorated with the placard "Chambers to Let," chanced to be, a rare thing, inhabited by numerous individuals who, however, as is always the case in Paris, had no connection with each other. All belonged to that indigent class which begins to separate from the lowest of the petty bourgeoisie in straitened circumstances, and which extends from misery to misery into the lowest depths of society down to those two beings in whom all the material things of civilization end: the sewer man who sweeps up the mud, and the rag picker who collects scraps. The principal lodger of Jean Valjean's day was dead, and had been replaced by another exactly like her. I know not what philosopher has said, "Old women are never lacking." This new old woman was named Madame Bourgon, and had nothing remarkable about her life, except a dynasty of 3 paroquets, who had reigned in succession over her soul. The most miserable of those who inhabited the hovel were a family of 4 persons, consisting of father, mother, and 2 daughters, already well grown, all 4 of whom were lodged in the same attic, one of the cells which we have already mentioned. At first sight this family presented no very special feature, except its extreme destitution. The father, when he hired the chamber, had stated that his name was Jondrette. Some time after his moving in, which had borne a singular resemblance to the entrance of nothing at all, to borrow the memorable expression of the principal tenant, this Jondrette had said to the woman, who, like her predecessor, was at the same time portress and stair-sweeper, "Mother so-and-so, if anyone should chance to come and inquire for a Pole or an Italian, or even a Spaniard perchance, it is I." This family was that of the merry barefoot boy. He arrived there and found distress, and, what is still sadder, no smile, a cold hearth, and cold hearts. When he entered, he was asked, "Whence come you?" He replied, "From the street." When he went away, they asked him, "Whither are you going?" He replied, "Into the streets." His mother said to him, "What did you come here for?" This child lived, in this absence of affection, like the pale plants which spring up in cellars. It did not cause him suffering, and he blamed no one. He did not know exactly how a father and mother should be. Nevertheless, his mother loved his sisters. We have forgotten to mention that on the Boulevard du Temple, this child was called Little Gavroche. Why was he called Little Gavroche? Probably because his father's name was Jondrette. It seems to be the instinct of certain wretched families to break the thread. The chamber which the Jondrettes inhabited in the Gorbeau hovel was the last at the end of the corridor. The cell next to it was occupied by a very poor young man who was called Monsieur Marius. Let us explain who this Monsieur Marius was. End of chapter 13 of Book 1 of Les Misérables, Volume 3. Recording by Adam Ringeth.
Book 2, The Great Bourgeois. Chapter 1, 90 Years and 32 Teeth. In the Rue Boucherat, Rue de Normandie, and the Rue de Saint-Ange, there still exist a few ancient inhabitants who have preserved the memory of a worthy man named Monsieur Gillenormand, and who mention him with complacence. This good man was old when they were young. This silhouette has not yet entirely disappeared. For those who regard with melancholy that vague swarm of shadows which is called the past, from the labyrinth of streets in the vicinity of the Temple to which, under Louis XIV, the names of all the provinces of France were appended exactly as in our day the streets of the New Tivoli quarter have received the names of all the capitals of Europe, a progression, by the way, in which progress is visible. Monsieur Gillenormand, who was as much alive as possible in 1831, was one of those men who had become curiosities to be viewed, simply because they have lived a long time, and who are strange because they formerly resembled everybody, and now resemble nobody. He was a peculiar old man, and in very truth a man of another age, the real, complete, and rather haughty bourgeois of the 18th century, who wore his good old bourgeoisie with the air with which marquises wear their marquisates. He was over 90 years of age. His walk was erect. He talked loudly, saw clearly, drank neat, ate, slept, and snored. He had all 32 of his teeth. He only wore spectacles when he read. He was of an amorous disposition, but declared that, for the last 10 years, he had wholly and decidedly renounced women. He could no longer please. He said, he did not add, "I am too old," but "I am too poor." He said, if I were not ruined, all he had left, in fact, was an income of about 15,000 francs. His dream was to come into an inheritance and to have 100,000 livres income for mistresses. He did not belong, as the reader will perceive, to that puny variety of octogenaries who, like M. de Voltaire, have been dying all their life. His was no longevity of a cracked pot. This jovial old man had always had good health. He was superficial, rapid, easily angered. He flew into a passion at everything, generally quite contrary to all reason. When contradicted, he raised his cane. He beat people as he had done in the great century. He had a daughter over 50 years of age and unmarried, whom he chastised severely with his tongue when in a rage, and whom he would have liked to whip. She seemed to him to be 8 years old. He boxed his servant's ears soundly and said, "Ah, carogne!" One of his oaths was by the pantaflash of the pantaflashade. He had singular freaks of tranquillity. He had himself shaved every day by a barber who had been mad and who detested him, being jealous of Monsieur Gillenormand on account of his wife, a pretty and coquettish barberess. Monsieur Gillenormand admired his own discernment in all things, and declared that he was extremely sagacious. Here is one of his sayings: "I have, in truth, some penetration. I am able to say when a flea bites me, from what woman it came." The words which he uttered the most frequently were, "the sensible man in nature." He did not give to this last word the grand acceptation which our epoch has accorded to it, but he made it enter, after his own fashion, into his little chimney-corner satires. "Nature," he said, "in order that civilization may have a little of everything, gives it even specimens of its amusing barbarism. Europe possesses specimens of Asia and Africa on a small scale. The cat is a drawing-room tiger. The lizard is a pocket crocodile. The dancers at the opera are pink female savages. They do not eat men, they crunch them. Or magicians that they are, they transform them into oysters and swallow them. The Caribbeans leave only the bones, they leave only the shell. Such are our morals. We do not devour, we gnaw. We do not exterminate, we claw." Chapter 2. Like master, like house. He lived in the Marais, Rue des Filles du Calvaire, number 6. He owned the house. This house has since been demolished and rebuilt, and the number has probably been changed in those revolutions of numeration which the streets of Paris undergo. He occupied an ancient and vast apartment on the first floor, between street and gardens, furnished to the very ceilings with the great Gobelin and Beauvais tapestries representing pastoral scenes. The subjects of the ceilings and the panels were repeated in miniature on the armchairs. He enveloped his bed in a vast 9-leaved screen of Coromandel lacquer. Long, full curtains hung from the windows and formed great, broken folds that were very magnificent. The garden, situated immediately under his windows, was attached to that one of them which formed the angle, by means of a staircase 12 or 15 steps long, which the old gentleman ascended and descended with great agility. In addition to a library adjoining his chamber, he had a boudoir of which he thought a great deal. A gallant and elegant retreat, with magnificent hangings of straw, with a pattern of flowers and fleur-de-lis made on the galleys of Louis XIV, and ordered of his convicts by Monsieur de Vivonne for his mistress. Monsieur Gillenormand had inherited it from a grim maternal great-aunt, who had died a centenarian. He had had 2 wives. His manners were something between those of a courtier, which he had never been, and the lawyer, which he might have been. He was gay and caressing when he had a mind. In his youth he had been one of those men who are always deceived by their wives, and never by their mistresses, because they are at the same time the most sullen of husbands and the most charming of lovers in existence. He was a connoisseur of painting. He had in his chamber a marvelous portrait of no one knows whom, painted by Jordaens, executed with great dashes of the brush, with millions of details, in a confused and haphazard manner. Monsieur Gillenormand's attire was not the habit of Louis XIV, nor yet that of Louis XVI. It was that of the incroyables of the Directory. He had thought himself young up to that period and had followed the fashions. His coat was of light-weight cloth with voluminous reverse, a long swallowtail, and large steel buttons. With this he wore knee breeches and buckle shoes. He always thrust his hands into his fobs. He said authoritatively, "The French Revolution is a heap of blackguards." Chapter 3. Luc Esprit. At the age of 16, one evening at the opera, he had had the honor to be stared at through opera glasses by two beauties at the same time. Ripe and celebrated beauties then, and sung by Voltaire, the Camargo and the Sale. Caught between two fires, he had beaten a heroic retreat towards a little dancer, a young girl named Henri, who was 16 like himself, obscure as a cat, and with whom he was in love. He abounded in memories. He was accustomed to exclaim, "How pretty she was, that Guimardini, Guimardinette. The last time I saw her at Longchamp, her hair curled in sustained sentiments, with her common sea of turquoises, her gown of the color of persons newly arrived, and her little agitation muff." He had worn in his young manhood a waistcoat of Nain Londrin, which he was fond of talking about effusively. "I was dressed like a Turk of the Levantine," said he. Madame Boufflers, having seen him by chance when he was 20, had described him as a charming fool. He was horrified by all the names which he saw in politics and in power, regarding them as vulgar and bourgeois. He read the journals, the newspapers, the gazettes, as he said, stifling outbursts of laughter the while. "Oh," he said, "what people these are! Corbière, Human, Casimir Perrier. There's a minister for you. I can imagine this in a journal. Monsieur Gillenormand, minister. That would be a farce. Well, they are so stupid that it would pass." He merrily called everything by its name, whether decent or indecent, and did not restrain himself in the least before ladies. He uttered coarse speeches, obscenities, and filth with a certain tranquillity and lack of astonishment which was elegant. It was in keeping with the unceremoniousness of his century. It is to be noted that the age of paraphrase in verse was the age of crudities in prose. His godfather had predicted that he would turn out a man of genius, and had bestowed upon him these two significant names, Luc Esprit. Chapter 4. A Centenarian Aspirant. He had taken prizes in his boyhood at the College of Moulins, where he was born, and he had been crowned by the hand of the Duc de Nivernais, whom he called the Duc de Nevers. Neither the Convention, nor the death of Louis XVI, nor the Napoleon, nor the return of the Bourbons, nor anything else had been able to efface the memory of this crowning. The Duc de Nevers was in his eyes the great figure of the century. "What a charming grand seigneur," he said, "and what a fine air he had with his blue ribbon." In the eyes of Monsieur Gillenormand, Catherine II had made reparation for the crime of the partition of Poland by purchasing, for 3,000 rubles, the secret of the elixir of gold from Bestucheff. He grew animated on this subject. "The elixir of gold," he exclaimed, "the yellow dye of Bestucheff. General Lamotte's drops in the 18th century. This was the great remedy for the catastrophes of love, the panacea against Venus. At 1 louis the half-ounce phial, Louis XV sent 200 phials of it to the Pope. He would have been greatly irritated and thrown off his balance had anyone told him that the elixir of gold is nothing but the perchloride of iron." Monsieur Gillenormand adored the Bourbons, and had a horror of 1789. He was forever narrating in what manner he had saved himself during the Terror, and how he had been obliged to display a vast deal of gaiety and cleverness in order to escape having his head cut off. If any young man ventured to pronounce a eulogium on the Republic in his presence, he turned purple and grew so angry that he was on the point of swooning. He sometimes alluded to his 90 years, and said, "I hope that I shall not see 93 twice." On these occasions, he hinted to people that he meant to live to be 100. End of Book 2, Chapter 4. Recording by Greg Bowman. Book 2, Great Bourgeois, Chapter 5, Basque and Nicolette. He had theories. Here's one of them. When a man is passionately fond of women, and when he himself has a wife for whom he cares but little, who is homely, cross, legitimate, with plenty of rights, perched on the code and jealous at need, there is but one way of extricating himself from the quandary and of procuring peace, and that is to let his wife control the purse strings. This abdication sets him free. Then his wife busies herself, grows passionately fond of handling coin, gets her fingers covered with verdigris in the process, undertakes the education of half-share tenants and the training of farmers, convokes lawyers, presides over notaries, harangues scriveners, visits limbs of the law, follows lawsuits, draws up leases, dictates contracts, feels herself the sovereign, sells, buys, regulates, promises and compromises, binds fast and annuls, yields, concedes and retrocedes, arranges, disarranges, hoards, lavishes, she commits follies, a supreme and personal delight, and that consoles her. While her husband disdains her, she has the satisfaction of ruining her husband. This theory Monsieur Gillenormand had himself replied, and it had become his history. His wife, the second one, had administered his fortune in such a manner that one fine day, when Monsieur Gillenormand found himself a widower, there remained to him just sufficient to live on by sinking nearly the whole of it in an annuity of 15,000 francs, 3/4 of which would expire with him. He had not hesitated on this point, not being anxious to leave a property behind him. Besides, he had noticed that patrimonies are subject to adventures, and, for instance, become national property. He had been present at the avatars of consolidated 3%, and he had no great faith in the great book of the public debt. All that's the Rue Quincampoix, he said. His house in the Rue Fille du Claver belonged to him, as we have already stated. He had 2 servants, a male and a female. When a servant entered his establishment, Monsieur Gillenormand rebaptized him. He bestowed on the men the name of their province, Nîmois, Comtois, Poitevin, Picard. His last valet was a big, foundered, short-winded fellow of 55, who was incapable of running 20 paces. But, as he had been born at Bayonne, Monsieur Gillenormand called him Basque. All the female servants in his house were called Nicolette, even the Magnon, of whom we shall hear more farther on. One day a haughty cook, a cordon bleu of the lofty race of porters, presented herself. "How much wages do you want a month?" asked Monsieur Gillenormand. 30 francs. "What is your name?" "Olympie." "You shall have 50 francs, and you shall be called Nicolette." Chapter 6, in which Magnon and her 2 children are seen. With Monsieur Gillenormand, sorrow was converted into wrath. He was furious at being in despair. He had all sorts of prejudices, and took all sorts of liberties. One of the facts of which his exterior relief and his internal satisfaction was composed was, as we have just hinted, that he had remained a brisk spark, and that he passed energetically for such. This he called having royal renown. This royal renown sometimes drew down upon him singular windfalls. One day there was brought to him in a basket, as though it had been a basket of oysters, a stout, newly born boy who was yelling like the deuce and duly wrapped in swaddling clothes, which a servant maid, dismissed 6 months previously, attributed to him. Monsieur Gillenormand had, at the time, fully completed his 84th year. Indignation and uproar in the establishment. And whom did that bold hussy think she could persuade to believe that? What audacity! What an abominable calumny! Monsieur Gillenormand himself was not at all enraged. He gazed at the brat with the amiable smile of a good man who is flattered by the calumny, and said in an aside, "Well, what now? What's the matter? You are finely taken aback, and really, you are excessively ignorant. Monsieur le Duc d'Angoulême, the bastard of His Majesty Charles IX, married a silly jade of 15 when he was 85. Monsieur Virginal, Marquis d'Allieu, brother to the Cardinal de Sourdis, Archbishop of Bordeaux, had, at the age of 83, by the maid of Madame la Présidente Jacquine, a son, a real child of love, who became a Chevalier of Malta and a Councillor of State, one of the great men of this century. The Abbé Tabarot is the son of a man of 87. There is nothing out of the ordinary in these things. And then the Bible. Upon that I declare that this little gentleman is none of mine. Let him be taken care of. It is not his fault. This manner of procedure was good-tempered. The woman, whose name was Magnon, sent him another parcel in the following year. It was a boy again. Thereupon Monsieur Gillenormand capitulated. He sent the two brats back to their mother, promising to pay 80 francs a month for their maintenance, on the condition that the said mother would not do so any more. He added, "I insist upon it, that the mother shall treat them well. I shall go to see them from time to time." And this he did. He had had a brother who was a priest, and who had been rector of the Academy of Poitiers for 33 years, and had died at 79. "I lost him young," said he. This brother, of whom but little memory remains, was a peaceable miser, who, being a priest, thought himself bound to bestow alms on the poor whom he met. But he never gave them anything except bad or demonetized sous, thereby discovering a means of going to hell by way of paradise. As for Monsieur Gillenormand the elder, he never haggled over his almsgiving, but gave gladly and nobly. He was kindly, abrupt, charitable, and if he had been rich, his turn of mind would have been magnificent. He desired that all which concerned him should be done in a grand manner, even his rogueries. One day, having been cheated by a businessman in a matter of inheritance, in a gross and apparent manner, he uttered this solemn exclamation, "That was indecently done. I am really ashamed of this pilfering. Everything has degenerated in this century, even the rascals. Morbleu! This is not the way to rob a man of my standing. I am robbed as though in a forest, but badly robbed. Silva sint consul digne." He had had 2 wives, as we have already mentioned. By the first he had had a daughter, who had remained unmarried, and by the second another daughter, who had died at about the age of 30, who had wedded, through love or chance or otherwise, a soldier of fortune who had served in the armies of the Republic and of the Empire, who had won the cross at Austerlitz and had been made a colonel at Waterloo. "He is the disgrace of my family," said the old bourgeois. He took an immense amount of snuff, and had a particularly graceful manner of plucking at his lace ruffle with the back of one hand. He believed very little in God. Chapter 7. Rule: receive no one except in the evening. Such was Monsieur Luc Esprit Gillenormand, who had not lost his hair, which was grey rather than white, and which was always dressed in dog's ears. To sum up, he was venerable in spite of all this. He had something of the 18th century about him, frivolous and great. In 1814, and during the early years of the Restoration, Monsieur Gillenormand, who was still young, he was only 74, lived in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, Rue Servandoni, near Saint-Sulpice. He had only retired to the Marais when he quitted society. long after attaining the age of 80. And on abandoning society, he had immured himself in his habits. The principal one, and that which was invariable, was to keep his door absolutely closed during the day, and never to receive anyone whatever except in the evening. He dined at 5 o'clock, and after that his door was open. That had been the fashion of his century, and he would not swerve from it. "The day is vulgar," said he, "and deserves only a closed shutter. Fashionable people only light up their minds when the zenith lights up its stars." And he barricaded himself against every one, even had it been the king himself. This was the antiquated elegance of his day. Chapter 8. Two do not make a pair. We have just spoken of Monsieur Gillenormand's 2 daughters. They had come into the world 10 years apart. In their youth, they had borne very little resemblance to each other, either in character or countenance, and had also been as little like sisters to each other as possible. The youngest had a charming soul which turned towards all that belongs to the light, was occupied with flowers, with verses, with music, which fluttered away into glorious space, enthusiastic, ethereal, and was wedded from her very youth, in ideal, to a vague and heroic figure. The elder also had her chimera, which she espied in the azure some very wealthy purveyor, a contractor, a splendidly stupid husband, a million-made man, or even a prefect, the receptions of a prefecture, an usher in the antechamber with a chain on his neck, official balls, the harangues of the town hall, to be Madame la Préfète. All this had created a whirlwind in her imagination. Thus the 2 sisters strayed, each in her own dream, at the epoch when they were young girls. Both had wings, the one like an angel, the other like a goose. No ambition is ever fully realized, here below at least. No paradise becomes terrestrial in our day. The younger wedded the man of her dreams, but she died. The elder did not marry at all. At the moment when she makes her entrance into this history which we are relating, she was an antique virtue, an incombustible prude, with one of the sharpest noses and one of the most obtuse minds that it is possible to see. A characteristic detail: outside of her immediate family, no one had ever known her first name. She was called Mademoiselle Gillenormand the elder. In the matter of cant, Mademoiselle Gillenormand could have given points to a miss. Her modesty was carried to the other extreme of blackness. She cherished a frightful memory of her life. One day, a man had beheld her garter. Age had only served to accentuate this pitiless modesty. Her guimpe was never sufficiently opaque, and never ascended sufficiently high. She multiplied clasps and pins where no one would have dreamed of looking. The peculiarity of prudery is to place all the more sentinels in proportion as the fortress is the less menaced. Nevertheless, let him who can explain these antique mysteries of innocence. She allowed an officer of the Lancers, her grand-nephew named Theodule, to embrace her without displeasure. In spite of this favored lancer, the label prude, under which we have classed her, suited her to absolute perfection. Mademoiselle Gillenormand was a sort of twilight soul. Prudery is a demi-virtue and a demi-vice. To prudery she added bigotry, a well-assorted lining. She belonged to the Society of the Virgin, wore a white veil on certain festivals, mumbled special orisons, revered the Holy Blood, venerated the Sacred Heart, remained for hours in contemplation before a Rococo Jesuit altar in a chapel which was inaccessible to the rank and file of the faithful, and there allowed her soul to soar among little clouds of marble and through great rays of gilded wood. she had a chapel friend, an ancient virgin like herself, named Mademoiselle Vaubois, who was a positive blockhead, and beside whom Mademoiselle Gillenormand had the pleasure of being an eagle. Beyond the Agnus Dei and Ave Maria, Mademoiselle Vaubois had no knowledge of anything except of the different ways of making preserves. Mademoiselle Vaubois, perfect in her style, was the ermine of stupidity without a single spot of intelligence. Let us say it plainly. Mademoiselle Gillenormand had gained rather than lost as she grew older. This is the case with passive natures. She had never been malicious, which is relative kindness. And then years wear away the angles, and the softening which comes with time had come to her. She was melancholy, with an obscure sadness of which she did not herself know the secret. There breathed from her whole person the stupor of a life that was finished, and which had never had a beginning. She kept house for her father. Monsieur Gillenormand had his daughter near him, as we have seen that Monseigneur Bienvenu had his sister with him. These households, comprised of an old man and an old spinster, are not rare, and always have the touching aspect of two weaknesses leaning on each other for support. There was also in this house, between this elderly spinster and this old man, a child, a little boy, who was always trembling and mute in the presence of Monsieur Gillenormand. Monsieur Gillenormand never addressed this child except in a severe voice, and sometimes with uplifted cane. "Here, sir, rascal, scoundrel, come here. Answer me, you scamp. Just let me see you, you good-for-nothing," etc., etc. He idolized him. This was his grandson. We shall meet with this child again later on. End of Book 2, Chapter 8. Recording by Greg Bowman.
Book 3, The Grandfather and the Grandson. Chapter 1, An Ancient Salon. When Monsieur Gillenormand lived in the Rue Servandoni, he had frequented many very good and very aristocratic salons. Although a bourgeois, Mr. Gillenormand was received in society, as he had double measure of wit, in the first place, that which was born with him, and secondly, that which was attributed to him. He was even sought out and made much of. He never went anywhere except in condition of being the chief person there. There are people who will have influence at any price, and who will have other people busy themselves over them. When they cannot be oracles, they turn wags. Monsieur Gillenormand was not of this nature. His domination in the royalist salons which he frequented cost his self-respect nothing. He was an oracle everywhere. It had happened to him to hold his own against Monsieur de Bonald, and even against Monsieur Bengy Puivalet. About 1817, he invariably passed 2 afternoons a week in a house in his own neighbourhood, in the Rue Férou, with Madame la Baronne de T, a worthy and respectable person, whose husband had been ambassador of France to Berlin under Louis XVI. Baron de T, who during his lifetime had gone very passionately into ecstasies and magnetic visions, had died bankrupt during the emigration, leaving as his entire fortune some very curious memoirs about Mesmer and his tub, in 10 manuscript volumes, bound in red morocco and gilded on the edges. Madame de T had not published the memoirs out of pride, and maintained herself on a meagre income which had survived no one knew how. Madame de T lived far from the court, a very mixed society, as she said, in a noble isolation, proud and poor. A few friends assembled twice a week about her widowed hearth, and these constituted a purely royalist salon. They sipped tea there, and uttered groans or cries of horror at the century, the charter, the Bonapartists, the prostitution of the blue ribbon, or the Jacobinism of Louis XVIII, according as the wind veered towards elegy or dithyrambs, and they spoke in low tones of the hopes which were presented by Monsieur, afterwards Charles X. The songs of the fishwomen, in which Napoleon was called Nicolas, was received there with transports of joy. Duchesses, the most delicate and charming women in the world, went into ecstasies over couplets like the following, addressed to the federates. Refoncez dans vos culottes le bout de chemise qui vous dépend. There they amused themselves with puns which were considered terrible, with innocent plays upon words which they supposed to be venomous, with quatrains with stystics even. Thus, upon the Dessolles ministry, a moderate cabinet of which Messieurs Descazes and de Serres were members. Pour affermir le trône ébranlé sur sa base, il faut changer de Sol et de Serres et de Cazes. Or they drew up a list of the Chamber of Peers, an abominably Jacobin chamber, and from this list they combined alliances of names in such a manner as to form, for example, phrases like the following: Damas, Sabran, Gouvion Saint-Cyr. All this was done merrily. In that society they parodied the revolution. They used, I know not what desire, to give point to the same rough in inverse sense. They sang their little ça ira. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, les Bonapartistes à la lanterne. Songs are like the guillotine, they chop away indifferently. Today this head, tomorrow that, it's only a variation. In the Fualdès affair, which belongs to this epoch, 1816, they took part of Bastide and Jausion because Fualdès was a Bonapartiste. They designated the liberals as friends and brothers. This constituted the most deadly insult. Like certain church towers, Madame de Tay's salon had two cocks. One of them was Monsieur Gillenormand, the other was Comte de la Motte Valois, of whom it was whispered about with a sort of respect. Do you know, that is the Lamotte of the affair of the necklace. These singular amnesties do occur in parties. Let us add the following. In the bourgeoisie, honoured situations decay through too easy relations. One must beware whom one admits. In the same way that there is a loss of caloric in the vicinity of those who are cold, there is a diminution of consideration in the approach of despised persons. The ancient society of the upper classes held themselves above this law, as above every other. Marigny, the brother of the Pompadour, had his entry with Monsieur le Prince de Soubise. In spite of? No, because. Du Barry, the godfather of the Vaubernier, was very welcome at the house of Monsieur le Maréchal de Richelieu. This society is Olympus. Mercury and the Prince of Guémené are at home there. A thief is admitted there, provided he be a god. The Comte de la Motte, who in 1815 was an old man 75 years of age, had nothing remarkable about him, except his silent and sententious air, his cold and angular face, his perfectly polished manners, his coat buttoned up to his cravat, and his long legs always crossed in the long flabby trousers of the hue of burnt sienna. His face was the same colour as his trousers. This Monsieur de la Motte was held in consideration in this salon on account of his celebrity and, strange to say, though true, because of his name of Valois. As for Gillenormand, his consideration was absolutely first-rate quality. He had, in spite of his levity and without its interfering in any way with his dignity, a certain manner about him which was imposing, dignified, honest, and lofty, in a bourgeois fashion, and his great age added to it. One is not a century with impunity. The years finally produce around a head a venerable dishevelment. In addition to this, he said things which had the genuine sparkle of the old rock. Thus, when the King of Prussia, after having restored Louis XVIII, came to pay the latter a visit under the name of the Count de Rupin, he was received by the descendant of Louis XIV, somewhat as though he had been the Marquis de Brandebourg, and with the most delicate impertinence. Monsieur Gillenormand approved. All kings who are not the King of France, said he, are provincial kings. One day, the following question was put, and the following answer returned in his presence. To what was the editor of the Courrier Français condemned? To be suspended. Ça c'est superfluous, observed Monsieur Gillenormand. Remarks of this nature found a situation. At the Te Deum, on the anniversary of the return of the Bourbons, he said, on seeing Monsieur de Talleyrand pass by, "There goes His Excellency the Evil One." Monsieur Gillenormand was always accompanied by his daughter, the tall mademoiselle, who was over 40 and looked 50, and by a handsome little boy of 7 years, white, rosy, fresh, with happy and trusting eyes, who never appeared in that salon without hearing voices murmur around him, "How handsome he is! What a pity! Poor child!" This child was the one of whom we dropped the word a while ago. He was called Poor Child because he had for a father a brigand of the Loire. This brigand of the Loire was Monsieur Gillenormand's son-in-law, who has already been mentioned, and whom Monsieur Gillenormand called the disgrace of his family. End of Book 3, Chapter 1. Recording by Cagliostro.
Book 3. The Grandfather and the Grandson. Chapter 2. One of the red spectres of that epoch. Anyone who had chanced to pass through the little town of Vernon at this epoch, and who had happened to walk across that fine monumental bridge, which will soon be succeeded, let us hope, by some hideous iron cable bridge, might have observed, had he dropped his eyes over the parapet, a man about 50 years of age, wearing a leather cap and trousers and a waistcoat of coarse grey cloth, to which something yellow which had been a red ribbon was sewn, shod with wooden sabots, tanned by the sun, his face nearly black and his hair nearly white, a large scar on his forehead which ran down upon his cheek, bowed, bent, prematurely aged, who walked nearly every day, hoe and sickle in hand, in one of those compartments surrounded by walls which abut on the bridge, and border the left bank of the Seine, like a chain of terraces, charming enclosures full of flowers, of which one could say, were they much larger, these are gardens, and were they a little smaller, these are bouquets. All these enclosures abut upon the river at one end, and on a house at the other. The man in the waistcoat and the wooden shoes of whom we have just spoken inhabited the smallest of these enclosures and the most humble of these houses, about 1817. He lived there alone and solitary, silently and poorly, with a woman who was neither young nor old, neither homely nor pretty, neither a peasant nor a bourgeoise, who served him. The plot of earth which he called his garden was celebrated in the town for the beauty of the flowers which he cultivated there. These flowers were his occupation. By dint of labor, of perseverance, of attention, and of buckets of water, he had succeeded in creating after the Creator, and he had invented certain tulips and certain dahlias which seemed to have been forgotten by nature. He was ingenious. He had forestalled Soulange Bodin in the formation of little clumps of earth of heath mould for the cultivation of rare and precious shrubs from America and China. He was in his alleys from the break of day in summer, planting, cutting, hoeing, watering, walking amid his flowers with an air of kindness, sadness, and sweetness, sometimes standing motionless and thoughtful for hours, listening to the song of a bird in the trees, the babble of a child in a house, or with his eyes fixed on a drop of dew at the tip of a spear of grass, of which the sun made a carbuncle. His table was very plain, and he drank more milk than wine. A child could make him give way, and his servant scolded him. He was so timid that he seemed shy. He rarely went out, and he saw no one but the poor people who tapped at his pane, and his curé, the Abbé Mabeuf, a good old man. Nevertheless, if the inhabitants of the town, or strangers, or any chance comers, curious to see his tulips, rang at his little cottage, he opened his door with a smile. He was the brigand of the Loire. Anyone who had at the same time read military memoirs, biographies, the Moniteur, and the bulletins of the Grand Army would have been struck by a name which occurs there with tolerable frequency, the name of Georges Pontmercy. When very young, this Georges Pontmercy had been a soldier in Saintonge's regiment. The Revolution broke out. Saintonge's regiment formed a part of the Army of the Rhine, for the old regiments of the monarchy preserved their names of provinces even after the fall of the monarchy, and were only divided into brigades in 1794. Pontmercy fought at Speer, at Worms, at Neustadt, at Turkheim, at Alzey, at Mayence, where he was one of the 200 who formed Houchard's rearguard. It was the 12th to hold its ground against the corps of the Prince of Hesse behind the old rampart of Andernach, and only rejoined the main body of the army when the enemy's cannon had opened a breach from the cord of the parapet to the foot of the glacis. He was under Kléber at Marchiennes and at the battle of Mont-Palissel, where a ball from a Biscayen broke his arm. Then he passed to the frontier of Italy, and was one of the 30 grenadiers who defended the Col de Tende with Joubert. Joubert was appointed its adjutant general and Pontmercy sub-lieutenant. Pontmercy was by Berthier's side in the midst of the grape shot of that day at Lodi, which caused Bonaparte to say, "Berthier has been cannoneer, cavalier, and grenadier." He beheld his old general, Joubert, fall at Novi, at the moment when, with uplifted sabre, he was shouting, "Forward!" Having been embarked with his company in the exigencies of the campaign, on board a pinnace which was proceeding from Genoa to some obscure port on the coast, he fell into a wasp's nest of 7 or 8 English vessels. The Genoese commander wanted to throw his cannon into the sea, to hide the soldiers between decks, and to slip along in the dark as a merchant vessel. Pontmercy had the colours hoisted to the peak and sailed proudly past under the guns of the British frigates. 20 leagues further on, his audacity having increased, he attacked with his pinnace and captured a large English transport which was carrying troops to Sicily, and which was so loaded down with men and horses that the vessel was sunk to the level of the sea. In 1805 he was in that Mahler division which took Günzburg from the Archduke Ferdinand. At Weltingen he received into his arms, beneath a storm of bullets, Colonel Maupetit, mortally wounded at the head of the 9th Dragoons. He distinguished himself at Austerlitz in that admirable march in echelons effected under the enemy's fire. When the cavalry of the Imperial Russian Guard crushed a battalion of the 4th of the line, Pontmercy was one of those who took their revenge and overthrew the Guard. The Emperor gave him the cross. Pontmercy saw Wurmser at Mantua, Mélas, and Alexandria, Mack at Ulm, made prisoners in succession. He formed a part of the 8th Corps of the Grand Army which Mortier commanded and which captured Hamburg. Then he was transferred to the 55th of the line, which was the old regiment of Flanders. At Eylau he was in the cemetery where, for the space of 2 hours, the heroic Captain Louis Hugo, the uncle of the author of this book, sustained alone with his company of 83 men every effort of the hostile army. Pontmercy was one of the 3 who emerged alive from that cemetery. He was at Friedland, then he saw Moscow, then La Beresina, then Lutzen, Bautzen, Dresden, Wachau, Leipzig, and the defiles of Galenhausen, then Montmirail, Château Thierry, Craon, the banks of the Marne, the banks of the Aisne, and the redoubtable position of Laon. At Arnay-le-Duc, being then a captain, he put 10 Cossacks to the sword and saved, not his general, but his corporal. He was well slashed up on this occasion, and 27 splinters were extracted from his left arm alone. 8 days before the capitulation of Paris, he had just exchanged with a comrade and entered the cavalry. He had what was called under the old regime the double hand, that is to say, an equal aptitude for handling the sabre or the musket as a soldier, or a squadron or a battalion as an officer. It is from this aptitude, perfected by a military education, which certain special branches of the service arise, the dragoons, for example, who are both cavalrymen and infantry at one and the same time. He accompanied Napoleon to the island of Elba. At Waterloo he was chief of a squadron of cuirassiers in Dubois' brigade. It was he who captured the standard of the Lunenburg battalion. He came and cast the flag at the Emperor's feet. He was covered with blood. While tearing down the banner, he had received a sword cut across his face. The Emperor, greatly pleased, shouted to him, "You are a colonel, you are a baron, you are an officer of the Legion of Honor." Pontmercy replied, "Sire, I thank you for my widow." An hour later he fell in the ravine of Ohain. Now, who was this Georges Pontmercy? He was this same brigand of the Loire. We have already seen something of his history. After Waterloo, Pontmercy, who had been pulled out of the hollow road of Ohain, as it will be remembered, had succeeded in joining the army, and had dragged himself from ambulance to ambulance as far as the cantonments of the Loire. The Restoration had placed him on half pay, then had sent him into residence, that is to say, under surveillance at Vernon. King Louis XVIII, regarding all that which had taken place during the 100 days as not having occurred at all, did not recognize his quality as an officer of the Legion of Honor, nor his grade of colonel, nor his title of baron. He, on his side, neglected no occasion of signing himself Colonel Baron Pontmercy. He had only an old blue coat, and he never went out without fastening to it his rosette as an officer of the Legion of Honor. The attorney for the crown had him warned that the authorities would prosecute him for illegal wearing of this decoration. When this notice was conveyed to him through an officious intermediary, Pontmercy retorted with a bitter smile, "I do not know whether I no longer understand French or whether you no longer speak it, but the fact is that I do not understand." Then he went out for 8 successive days with his rosette. They dared not interfere with him. 2 or 3 times the Minister of War and the general in command of the department wrote to him with the following address, "À Monsieur le Commandant Pontmercy." He sent back the letters with the seals unbroken. At the same moment, Napoleon at St. Helena was treating in the same fashion the missives of Sir Hudson Lowe, addressed to General Bonaparte. Pontmercy had ended, may we be pardoned the expression, by having in his mouth the same saliva as his emperor. In the same way, there were at Rome Carthaginian prisoners who refused to salute Flaminius, and who had a little of Hannibal's spirit. One day he encountered the district attorney in one of the streets of Vernon, stepped up to him and said, "Mr. Crown Attorney, am I permitted to wear my scar?" He had nothing save his meagre half-pay as chief of squadron. He had hired the smallest house which he could find at Vernon. He lived there alone, we have just seen how. Under the Empire, between 2 wars, he had found time to marry Mademoiselle Gillenormand. The old bourgeois, thoroughly indignant at bottom, had given his consent with a sigh, saying, "The greatest families are forced into it." In 1815, Madame Pontmercy, an admirable woman in every sense, by the way, lofty in sentiment and rare, and worthy of her husband, died, leaving a child. This child had been the colonel's joy in his solitude, but the grandfather had imperatively claimed his grandson, declaring that if the child were not given to him, he would disinherit him. The father had yielded in the little one's interest, and had transferred his love to flowers. Moreover, he had renounced everything, and neither stirred up mischief nor conspired. He shared his thoughts between the innocent things which he was then doing, and the great things which he had done. He passed his time in expecting a pink, or in recalling Austerlitz. Monsieur Gillenormand kept up no relations with his son-in-law. The colonel was a bandit to him. Monsieur Gillenormand never mentioned the colonel except when he occasionally made mocking allusions to his baronship. It had been expressly agreed that Pontmercy should never attempt to see his son nor to speak to him, under penalty of having the latter handed over to him, disowned and disinherited. For the Gillenormands, Pontmercy was a man afflicted with the plague. They intended to bring up the child in their own way. Perhaps the colonel was wrong to accept these conditions, but he submitted to them, thinking that he was doing right and sacrificing no one but himself. The inheritance of Father Gillenormand did not amount to much, but the inheritance of Mademoiselle Gillenormand the elder was considerable. This aunt, who had remained unmarried, was very rich on the maternal side, and her sister's son was her natural heir. The boy, whose name was Marius, knew that he had a father, but nothing more. No one opened his mouth to him about it. Nevertheless, in the society into which his grandfather took him, whispers, innuendos, and winks had eventually enlightened the little boy's mind. He had finally understood something of the case, and as he naturally took in the ideas and opinions, which were, so to speak, the air he breathed, by a sort of infiltration and slow penetration, he gradually came to think of his father only with shame and with a pain at his heart. While he was growing up in this fashion, the colonel slipped away every 2 or 3 months, came to Paris on the sly, like a criminal breaking his ban, and went and posted himself at Saint-Sulpice, at the hour when Aunt Gillenormand led Marius to the mass. There, trembling lest the aunt should turn around, concealed behind a pillar, motionless, not daring to breathe, he gazed at his child. The scarred veteran was afraid of that old spinster. From this had arisen his connection with the curé of Vernon, Monsieur l'Abbé Mabeuf. That worthy priest was the brother of a warden of Saint-Sulpice, who had often observed this man gazing at his child, and the scar on his cheek and the large tears in his eyes. That man, who had so manly an air, yet who was weeping like a woman, had struck the warden. That face had clung to his mind. One day, having gone to Vernon to see his brother, he had encountered Colonel Pontmercy on the bridge, and had recognized the man of Saint-Sulpice. The warden had mentioned the circumstance to the curé, and both had paid the colonel a visit on some pretext or other. This visit led to others. The colonel, who had been extremely reserved at first, ended by opening his heart, and the curé and the warden finally came to know the whole history, and how Pontmercy was sacrificing his happiness to his child's future. This caused the curé to regard him with veneration and tenderness, and the colonel, on his side, became fond of the curé. And moreover, when both are sincere and good, no men so penetrate each other, and so amalgamate with each other, as an old priest and an old soldier. At bottom, the man is the same. The one has devoted his life to his country here below, the other to his country on high. That is the only difference. Twice a year, on the 1st of January and on St. George's Day, Marius wrote duty letters to his father, which were dictated by his aunt, and which one would have pronounced to be copied from some formula. This was all that M. Gillenormand tolerated, and the father answered them with very tender letters, which the grandfather thrust into his pocket unread. End of Book 3, Chapter 2. Book 3, The Grandfather and the Grandson. Chapter 3, Requiescant. Madame de T.'s salon was all that Marius Pontmercy knew of the world. It was the only opening through which he could get a glimpse of life. This opening was sombre, and more cold than warmth, more night than day, came to him through this skylight. This child, who had been all joy and light on entering this strange world, soon became melancholy, and what is still more contrary to his age, grave. Surrounded by all those singular and imposing personages, he gazed about him with serious amazement. Everything conspired to increase this astonishment in him. There were in Madame de T.'s salon some very noble ladies named Mathin, Noé, Lévis, Levis, which was pronounced Lévis, Cambise, Cambis, pronounced Cambise. These antique visages and these biblical names mingled in the child's mind with the Old Testament which he was learning by heart. And when they were all there, seated in a circle around a dying fire, sparely lighted by a lamp shaded with green, with their severe profiles, their grey or white hair, their long gowns of another age, whose lugubrious colours could not be distinguished, dropping at rare intervals words which were both majestic and severe, little Marius stared at them with frightened eyes, in the conviction that he beheld not women, but patriarchs, and magi, not real beings, but phantoms. With these phantoms, priests were sometimes mingled, frequenters of this ancient salon, and some gentlemen, the Marquis de Sasse, private secretary to Madame de Berry, the Vicomte de Val, who published under the pseudonym of Charles Antoine mono-rhymed odes, the Prince de Beauf, who, though very young, had a grey head and a pretty and witty wife, whose very low-necked toilettes of scarlet velvet with gold torsades alarmed these shadows, the Marquis de C. de E., the man in all France who best understood proportioned politeness, the Comte d'Am, the kindly man with the amiable chin, and the Chevalier de Portegui, a pillar of the library of the Louvre, called the King's Cabinet. Monsieur de Portegui, bald and rather aged than old, was wont to relate that in 1793, at the age of 16, he had been put in the galleys as refractory and chained with an octogenarian, the Bishop of Mirepoix, also refractory, but as a priest, while he was so in the capacity of a soldier. This was at Toulon. Their business was to go at night and gather up on the scaffold the heads and bodies of the persons who had been guillotined during the day. They bore away on their backs these dripping corpses, and their red galley slave blouses had a clot of blood at the back of the neck, which was dry in the morning and wet at night. These tragic tales abounded in Madame de T.'s salon, and by dint of cursing Marat, they applauded Trestaillon. Some deputies of the undiscoverable variety played their whist there. Monsieur Thibault du Chalard, Monsieur Lemarchand de Gomicourt, and the celebrated scoffer of the right, Monsieur Cornet d'Incourt. The bailiff de Ferrette, with his short breeches and his thin legs, sometimes traversed this salon on his way to Monsieur de Talleyrand. He had been Monsieur le Comte d'Artois' companion in pleasures, and unlike Aristotle crouching under Campaspe, he had made the Guimard crawl on all fours, and in that way he had exhibited to the ages a philosopher avenged by a bailiff. As for the priests, there was the Abbé Halma, the same to whom Monsieur Larose, his collaborator on La Foudre, said, "Bah, who is there who is not 50 years old? A few greenhorns, perhaps?" The Abbé Le Tournaire, preacher to the king, the Abbé Frayssinous, who was not as yet either count or bishop or minister or peer, and who wore an old cassock whose buttons were missing, and the Abbé Caravenon, curé of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, also the Pope's nuncio, then Monsignor Macchi, Archbishop of Nisibi, later on cardinal, remarkable for his long pensive nose, and another Monsignor entitled thus, Abbate Palmieri, domestic prelate, one of the 7 participant prothonotarios of the Holy See, canon of the illustrious Liberian Basilica, advocate of the saints, postulatore Dei Sancti, which refers to matters of canonization, and signifies very nearly master of requests of the section of Paradise. Lastly, 2 cardinals, Monsieur de la Luzerne and Monsieur de Ciel-T. The Cardinal of Luzerne was a writer and was destined to have, a few years later, the honor of signing in the Conservateur articles side by side with Chateaubriand. Monsieur de Ciel-T was Archbishop of Toul and often made trips to Paris to his nephew, the Marquis de T, who was Minister of Marine and War. The Cardinal of Ciel-T was a merry little man who displayed his red stockings beneath his tucked-up cassock. His specialty was a hatred of the encyclopedia, and his desperate play at billiards, and persons who, at that epoch, passed through the Rue M on summer evenings, where the Hôtel de Ciel-T then stood, halted to listen to the shock of the balls, and the piercing voice of the cardinal shouting to his conclavist, Monseigneur Cotteret, Bishop in partibus of Cariste, "Marc Abbé, I make a canon." The Cardinal de Ciel-T had been brought to Madame de T's by his most intimate friend, Monsieur de Roquelaure, former Bishop of Senlis and one of the 40. Monsieur de Roquelaure was notable for his lofty figure and his assiduity at the Academy. Through the glass door of the neighboring hall of the library where the French Academy then held its meetings, the curious could, on every Tuesday, contemplate the ex-bishop of Senlis, usually standing erect, freshly powdered, in violet hose, with his back turned to the door, apparently for the purpose of allowing a better view of his little collar. All these ecclesiastics, though for the most part as much courtiers as churchmen, added to the gravity of the tea salon, whose seigneurial aspect was accentuated by 5 peers of France, the Marquis de Vib, the Marquis de Tal, the Marquis de Herbe, the Vicomte d'Am, and the Duc de Val. This Duc de Val, although Prince de Mont, that is to say, a reigning prince abroad, had so high an idea of France and its peerage that he viewed everything through their medium. It was he who said, "The cardinals are the peers of France of Rome. The lords are the peers of France of England." Moreover, as it is indispensable that the revolution should be everywhere in this century, this feudal salon was, as we have said, dominated by a bourgeois. Monsieur Gillenormand reigned there. There lay the essence and quintessence of the Parisian white society. There, reputations, even royalist reputations, were held in quarantine. There is always a trace of anarchy in renown. Chateaubriand, had he entered there, would have produced the effect of Père Duchesne. Some of the scoffed at did, nevertheless, penetrate thither on sufferance. Comte Beug was received there, subject to correction. The noble salons of the present day no longer resemble those salons. The Faubourg Saint-Germain reeks of the faggot even now. The royalists of today are demagogues, let us record it to their credit. At Madame de T's the society was superior, taste was exquisite and haughty, under the cover of a great show of politeness. Manners there admitted of all sorts of involuntary refinements, which were the old regime itself, buried but still alive. Some of these habits, especially in the matter of language, seem eccentric. Persons but superficially acquainted with them would have taken for provincial that which was only antique. A woman was called Madame la Générale. Madame la Colonelle was not entirely disused. The charming Madame de Léon, in memory no doubt of the Duchesse de Longueville and de Chevreuse, preferred this appellation to her title of Princesse. The Marquise de Créqui was also called Madame la Colonelle. It was this little high society which invented at the Tuileries the refinement of speaking to the king in private as the king in the third person, and never as your majesty, the designation of your majesty having been soiled by the usurper. Men and deeds were brought to judgment there. They jeered at the age, which released them from the necessity of understanding it. They abetted each other in amazement. They communicated to each other that modicum of light which they possessed. Methuselah bestowed information on Epimenides. The deaf man made the blind man acquainted with the course of things. They declared that the time which had elapsed since Coblentz had not existed, in the same manner that Louis XVIII was, by the grace of God, in the 25th year of his reign. The emigrants were, by rights, in the 25th year of their adolescence. All was harmonious. Nothing was too much alive. Speech hardly amounted to a breath. The newspapers, agreeing with the salons, seemed a papyrus. There were some young people, but they were rather dead. The liveries in the antechamber were antiquated. These utterly obsolete personages were served by domestics of the same stamp. They all had the air of having lived a long time ago, and of obstinately resisting the sepulchre. Nearly the whole dictionary consisted of conserver, conservation, conservateur, to be in good odor. That was the point. There are, in fact, aromatics in the opinions of these venerable groups, and their ideas smelled of it. It was a mummified society. The masters were embalmed. The servants were stuffed with straw. A worthy old marquise, an émigré and ruined, who had but a solitary maid, continued to say, "My people." What did they do in Madame de T.'s salon? They were ultra. To be ultra, this word, although what it represents may not have disappeared, has no longer any meaning at the present day. Let us explain it. To be ultra is to go beyond. It is to attack the scepter in the name of the throne, and the mitre in the name of the attar. It is to ill-treat the thing which one is dragging. It is to kick over the traces. It is to cavil at the faggot on the score of the amount of cooking received by heretics. It is to reproach the idol with its small amount of idolatry. It is to insult through excess of respect. It is to discover that the Pope is not sufficiently papish, that the king is not sufficiently royal, and that the night has too little light. It is to be discontented with alabaster, with snow, with the swan and the lily in the name of whiteness. It is to be a partisan of things to the point of becoming their enemy. It is to be so strongly for as to be against. The ultra spirit especially characterizes the first phase of the Restoration. Nothing in history resembles that quarter of an hour which begins in 1814 and terminates about 1820 with the advent of Monsieur de Villèle, the practical man of the right. These 6 years were an extraordinary moment, at one and the same time brilliant and gloomy, smiling and sombre, illuminated as by the radiance of dawn, and entirely covered at the same time with the shadows of the great catastrophes which still filled the horizon and were slowly sinking into the past. There existed in that light and that shadow a complete little new and old world, comic and sad, juvenile and senile, which was rubbing its eyes. Nothing resembles an awakening like a return. A group which regarded France with ill temper and which France regarded with irony, good old owls of marquises by the streetful, who had returned, and of ghosts, the former subjects of amazement at everything. Brave and noble gentlemen who smiled at being in France, but wept also, delighted to behold their country once more, in despair at not finding their monarchy. The nobility of the Crusades treating the nobility of the empire, that is to say, the nobility of the sword, with scorn. Historic races who had lost the sense of history. the sons of the companions of Charlemagne disdaining the companions of Napoleon. The swords, as we have just remarked, returned the insult. The sword of Fontenoy was laughable and nothing but a scrap of rusty iron. The sword of Marengo was odious and was only a sabre. Former days did not recognize yesterday. People no longer had the feeling for what was grand. There was someone who called Bonaparte Scapin. This society no longer exists. Nothing of it, we repeat, exists today. When we select from it some one figure at random, attempt to make it live again in thought, it seems as strange to us as the world before the deluge. It is because it too, as a matter of fact, has been engulfed in a deluge. It has disappeared beneath 2 revolutions. What billows are ideas! How quickly they cover all that it is their mission to destroy and to bury, and how promptly they create frightful gulfs. Such was the physiognomy of the salons of those distant and candid times when Monsieur Martainville had more wit than Voltaire. These salons had a literature and politics of their own. They believed in Fiévée. Monsieur Agier laid down the law in them. They commentated Monsieur Colnet, the old bookseller and publicist of the Quai Malaquais. Napoleon was to them thoroughly the Corsican ogre. Later on, the introduction into history of Monsieur le Marquis de Bonaparte, Lieutenant General of the King's armies, was a concession to the spirit of the age. These salons did not long preserve their purity. Beginning with 1818, doctrinarians began to spring up in them, a disturbing shade. Their way was to be royalists and to excuse themselves for being so. Where the ultras were very proud, the doctrinarians were rather ashamed. They had wit, they had silence. Their political dogma was suitably impregnated with arrogance. They should have succeeded. They indulged, and usefully too, in excesses in the matter of white neckties and tightly buttoned coats. The mistake or the misfortune of the doctrinarian party was to create aged youth. They assumed the poses of wise men. They dreamed of engrafting a temperate power on the absolute and excessive principle. They opposed, and sometimes with rare intelligence, conservative liberalism to the liberalism which demolishes. They were heard to say, "Thanks for royalism, it has rendered more than one service. It has brought back tradition, worship, religion, respect. It is faithful, brave, chivalric, loving, devoted. It has mingled, though with regret, the secular grandeurs of the monarchy with the new grandeurs of the nation. Its mistake is not to understand the revolution, the empire, glory, liberty, young ideas, young generations, the age. But this mistake which it makes with regard to us, have we not sometimes been guilty of it towards them? The revolution, whose heirs we are, ought to be intelligent on all points. To attack royalism is a misconstruction of liberalism. What an error! And what blindness! Revolutionary France is wanting in respect towards historic France, that is to say, towards its mother, that is to say, towards itself. After the 5th of September, the nobility of the monarchy is treated as the nobility of the empire was treated after the 5th of July. They were unjust to the eagle as we are unjust to the fleur-de-lis. It seems that we must always have something to proscribe. Does it serve any purpose to ungild the crown of Louis XIV, to scrape the coat of arms of Henri IV? We scoff at Monsieur de Vaublanc for erasing the N's from the bridge of Jena. What was it that he did? What are we doing? Bouvines belongs to us as well as Marengo. The fleur-de-lis are ours as well as the N's. That is our patrimony. To what purpose shall we diminish it? We must not deny our country in the past any more than in the present. Why not accept the whole of history? Why not love the whole of France? It was thus that doctrinarians criticized and protected royalism, which was displeased at criticism and furious at protection. The ultras marked the first epoch of royalism. Congregation characterized the second. Skill follows ardor. Let us confine ourselves here to this sketch. In the course of this narrative, the author of this book has encountered in his path this curious moment of contemporary history. He has been forced to cast a passing glance upon it, and to trace once more some of the singular features of this society which is unknown today. But he does it rapidly and without any bitter or derisive idea. Souvenirs both respectful and affectionate, for they touch his mother, attach him to this past. Moreover, let us remark, this same petty world had a grandeur of its own. One may smile at it, but one can neither despise nor hate it. It was the France of former days. Marius Pontmercy pursued some studies, as all children do. When he emerged from the hands of Aunt Gillenormand, his grandfather confided him to a worthy professor of the most purely classic innocence. This young soul which was expanding passed from a prude to a vulgar pedant. Marius went through his years of college, then he entered the law school. He was a royalist, fanatical and severe. He did not love his grandfather much, as the latter's gaiety and cynicism repelled him, and his feelings towards his father were gloomy. He was, on the whole, a cold and ardent, noble, generous, proud, religious, enthusiastic lad, dignified to harshness, pure to shyness. End of Book 3, Chapter 3. Book 3, The Grandfather and the Grandson. Chapter 4, End of the Brigand. The conclusion of Marius's classical studies coincided with Monsieur Gillenormand's departure from society. The old man bade farewell to the Faubourg Saint-Germain and to Madame de T.'s salon, and established himself in the Mardi in his house of the Rue des Filles du Calvaire. There he had for servants, in addition to the porter, that chambermaid Nicolette who had succeeded to Magnon, and that short-breathed and pursy Basque who have been mentioned above. In 1827, Marius had just attained his 17th year. One evening, on his return home, he saw his grandfather holding a letter in his hand. "Marius," said Monsieur Gillenormand, "you will set out for Vernon tomorrow." "Why?" said Marius. "To see your father." Marius was seized with a trembling fit. He had thought of everything except this, that he should one day be called upon to see his father. Nothing could be more unexpected, more surprising, and, let us admit it, more disagreeable to him. It was forcing estrangement into reconciliation. It was not an affliction, but it was an unpleasant duty. Marius, in addition to his motives of political antipathy, was convinced that his father, the slasher, as Monsieur Gillenormand called him on his amiable days, did not love him. This was evident, since he had abandoned him to others. Feeling that he was not beloved, he did not love. Nothing is more simple, he said to himself. He was so astounded that he did not question Monsieur Gillenormand. The grandfather resumed, "It appears that he is ill. He demands your presence." And after a pause he added, "Set out tomorrow morning. I think there is a coach which leaves the Cour des Fontaines at 6 o'clock, and which arrives in the evening. Take it. He says that here is haste." Then he crushed the letter in his hand and thrust it into his pocket. Marius might have set out that very evening and have been with his father on the following morning. A diligence from the Rue du Boulois took the trip to Rouen by night at that date and passed through Vernon. Neither Marius nor Monsieur Gillenormand thought of making inquiries about it. The next day, at twilight, Marius reached Vernon. People were just beginning to light their candles. He asked the first person whom he met for Monsieur Pontmercy's house. For in his own mind he agreed with the Restoration, and like it, did not recognize his father's claim to the title of either colonel or baron. The house was pointed out to him. He rang. A woman with a little lamp in her hand opened the door. "Monsieur Pontmercy," said Marius. The woman remained motionless. "Is this his house?" demanded Marius. The woman nodded affirmatively. "Can I speak with him?" The woman shook her head. "But I am his son," persisted Marius. "He is expecting me." "He no longer expects you," said the woman. Then he perceived that she was weeping. She pointed to the door of a room on the ground floor. He entered. In that room, which was lighted by a tallow candle standing on the chimney-piece, there were 3 men, one standing erect, another kneeling, and one lying at full length on the floor in his shirt. The one on the floor was the colonel. The other 2 were the doctor and the priest who was engaged in prayer. The colonel had been attacked by brain fever 3 days previously. As he had a foreboding of evil at the very beginning of his illness, he had written to Monsieur Gillenormand to demand his son. The malady had grown worse. On the very evening of Marius's arrival at Vernon, the colonel had had an attack of delirium. He had risen from his bed, in spite of the servant's efforts to prevent him, crying, "My son is not coming. I shall go to meet him." Then he ran out of his room and fell prostrate on the floor of the antechamber. He had just expired. The doctor had been summoned, and the curé. The doctor had arrived too late. The son had also arrived too late. By the dim light of the candle, a large tear could be distinguished on the pale and prostrate colonel's cheek, where it had trickled from his dead eye. The eye was extinguished, but the tear was not yet dry. That tear was his son's delay. Marius gazed upon that man whom he beheld for the first time, on that venerable and manly face, on those open eyes which saw not, on those white locks, those robust limbs, on which here and there brown lines marking sword thrusts, and a sort of red stars, which indicated bullet holes, were visible. He contemplated that gigantic scar which stamped heroism on that countenance upon which God had imprinted goodness. He reflected that this man was his father, and that this man was dead, and a chill ran over him. The sorrow which he felt was the sorrow which he would have felt in the presence of any other man whom he had chanced to behold stretched out in death. Anguish, poignant anguish, was in that chamber. The servant woman was lamenting in a corner, the curé was praying, and his sobs were audible. The doctor was wiping his eyes. The corpse itself was weeping. The doctor, the priest, and the woman gazed at Marius in the midst of their affliction without uttering a word. He was the stranger there. Marius, who was far too little affected, felt ashamed and embarrassed at his own attitude. He held his hat in his hand, and he dropped it on the floor in order to produce the impression that grief had deprived him of the strength to hold it. At the same time he experienced remorse, and he despised himself for behaving in this manner. But was it his fault? He did not love his father? Why should he? The colonel had left nothing. The sale of big furniture barely paid the expenses of his burial. The servant found a scrap of paper which she handed to Marius. It contained the following in the colonel's handwriting. "For my son, the Emperor made me a baron on the battlefield of Waterloo. Since the Restoration disputes my right to this title, which I purchased with my blood, my son shall take it and bear it. That he will be worthy of it is a matter of course." Below, the colonel had added, "At that same battle of Waterloo, a sergeant saved my life. The man's name was Thénardier. I think that he has recently been keeping a little inn in a village in the neighborhood of Paris, at Chelles or Montfermeil. If my son meets him, he will do all the good he can to Thénardier." Marius took this paper and preserved it, not out of duty to his father, but because of that vague respect for death which is always imperious in the heart of man. Nothing remained of the colonel. M. Gillenormand had his sword and uniform sold to an old clothes dealer. The neighbors devastated the garden and pillaged the rare flowers. The other plants turned to nettles and weeds and died. Marius remained only 48 hours at Vernon. After the interment, he returned to Paris and applied himself again to his law studies with no more thought of his father than if the latter had never lived. In 2 days the colonel was buried, and in 3 forgotten. Marius wore crape on his hat. That was all. End of Book 3, Chapter 4.
Book 3, The Grandfather and the Grandson. Chapter 5, The Utility of Going to Mass in Order to Become a Revolutionist. Marius had preserved the religious habits of his childhood. One Sunday, when he went to hear Mass at Saint-Sulpice, at that same chapel of the Virgin, whither his aunt had led him when a small lad, he placed himself behind a pillar, being more absent-minded and thoughtful than usual on that occasion, and knelt down, without paying any special heed, upon a chair of Utrecht velvet, on the back of which was inscribed this name, Monsieur Mabeuf, Warden. Mass had hardly begun when an old man presented himself and said to Marius, "This is my place, sir." Marius stepped aside promptly, and the old man took possession of his chair. The Mass concluded, Marius still stood thoughtfully a few paces distant. The old man approached him again and said, "I beg your pardon, sir, for having disturbed you a while ago, and for again disturbing you at this moment. You must have thought me intrusive, and I will explain myself." "There is no need of that, sir," said Marius. "Yes," went on the old man, "I do not wish you to have a bad opinion of me. You see, I am attached to this place. It seems to me that the Mass is better from here. Why? I will tell you. It is from this place that I have watched a poor, brave father come regularly, every 2 or 3 months, for the last 10 years, since he had no other opportunity and no other way of seeing his child, because he was prevented by family arrangements. He came at the hour when he knew that his son would be brought to Mass. The little one never suspected that his father was there. Perhaps he did not even know that he had a father, poor innocent. The father kept behind a pillar so that he might not be seen. He gazed at his child, and he wept. He adored that little fellow, poor man. I could see that. This spot has become sanctified in my sight, and I have contracted a habit of coming hither to listen to the Mass. I prefer it to the stall to which I have a right in my capacity of warden. I knew that unhappy gentleman a little, too. He had a father-in-law, a wealthy aunt, relatives, I don't know exactly what all, who threatened to disinherit the child if he, the father, saw him. He sacrificed himself in order that his son might be rich and happy some day. He was separated from him because of political opinions. Certainly I approve of political opinions, but there are people who do not know where to stop. Mon Dieu. A man is not a monster because he was at Waterloo. A father is not separated from his child for such a reason as that. He was one of Bonaparte's colonels. He's dead, I believe. He lived at Vernon, where I have a brother who is a curé, and his name was something like Pontmarie or Montpercy. He had a fine sword cut, on my honor. Pontmercy? Suggested Marius, turning pale. Precisely, Pontmercy. Did you know him? Sir, said Marius, he was my father. The old warden clasped his hands and exclaimed, "Ah, you are the child." Yes, that's true. He must be a man by this time. Well, poor child, you may say that you had a father who loved you dearly. Marius offered his arm to the old man and conducted him to his lodgings. On the following day, he said to Monsieur Gillenormand, "I have arranged a hunting party with some friends. Will you permit me to be absent for 3 days?" "4," replied his grandfather. "Go and amuse yourself." And he said to his daughter in a low tone and with a wink, "Some love affair." End of Book 3, Chapter 5. Recording by Greg Bowman.
Book 3, The Grandfather and the Grandson. Chapter 6, The Consequences of Having Met a Warden. Where it was that Marius went will be disclosed a little further on. Marius was absent for 3 days. Then he returned to Paris, went straight to the library of the law school, and asked for the files of the Moniteur. He read the Moniteur. He read all the histories of the Republic and the Empire, the Memorial de Sainte Hélène, all the memoirs, all the newspapers, the bulletins, the proclamations. He devoured everything. The first time that he came across his father's name in the bulletins of the Grand Army, he had a fever for a week. He went to see the generals under whom Georges Pontmercy had served. Among others, Comte H. Churchwarden Mabeuf, whom he went to see again, told him about the life of Vernon, the colonel's retreat, his flowers, his solitude. Marius came to a full knowledge of that rare, sweet, and sublime man, that species of lion lamb who had been his father. In the meantime, occupied as he was with this study which absorbed all his moments as well as his thoughts, he hardly saw the Gillenormands at all. He made his appearance at meals, then they searched for him, and he was not to be found. Father Gillenormand smiled. Bah, bah, he's just at the age for the girls. Sometimes the old man added, The deuce! I thought it was only an affair of gallantry. It seems that it is an affair of passion. It was a passion, in fact. Marius was on the high road to adoring his father. At the same time, his ideas underwent an extraordinary change. The phases of this change were numerous and successive. As this is the history of many minds of our day, we think it will prove useful to follow these phases step by step and to indicate them all. That history upon which he had just cast his eyes appalled him. The first effect was to dazzle him. Up to that time, the Republic, the Empire, had been to him only monstrous words. The Republic, a guillotine in the twilight. The Empire, a sword in the night. He had just taken a look at it, and where he had expected to find only a chaos of shadows, he had beheld, with a sort of unprecedented surprise, mingled with fear and joy, stars sparkling. Mirabeau, Vergniaud, Saint-Just, Robespierre, Camille, Desmoulins, Danton, and a sun arise, Napoleon. He did not know where he stood. He recoiled, blinded by the brilliant lights. Little by little, when his astonishment had passed off, he grew accustomed to this radiance. He contemplated these deeds without dizziness. He examined these personages without terror. The Revolution and the Empire presented themselves luminously in perspective before his mind's eye. He beheld each of these groups of events and of men summed up in two tremendous facts: the Republic in the sovereignty of civil right restored to the masses, the Empire in the sovereignty of the French idea imposed on Europe. He beheld the grand figure of the people emerge from the Revolution and the grand figure of France spring forth from the Empire. He asserted in his conscience that all this had been good. What his dazzled state neglected in this, his first far too synthetic estimation, we do not think it necessary to point out here. It is the state of a mind on the march that we are recording. Progress is not accomplished in one stage. That stated once for all in connection with what precedes as well as with what is to follow, we continue. He then perceived that up to that moment he had comprehended his country no more than he had comprehended his father. He had not known either the one or the other, and a sort of voluntary night had obscured his eyes. Now he saw, and on the one hand he admired, while on the other he adored. He was filled with regret and remorse, and reflected in despair that all he had in his soul could now be said only to the tomb. Oh, if his father had still been in existence, if he had still had him, if God, in his compassion and his goodness, had permitted his father to be still among the living, how he would have run, how he would have precipitated himself, how he would have cried to his father, Father, here I am, it is I have the same heart as thou, I am thy son. How he would have embraced that white head, bathed his hair in tears, gazed upon his scar, pressed his hands, adored his garment, kissed his feet. Oh! Why had his father died so early, before his time, before the justice, the love of his son had come to him? Marius had a continual sob in his heart, which said to him every moment, Alas! At the same time, he became more truly serious, more truly grave, more sure of his thought and his faith. At each instant, gleams of the true came to complete his reason. An inward growth seemed to be in progress within him. He was conscious of a sort of natural enlargement, which gave him two things that were new to him, his father and his country. As everything opens when one has a key, so he explained to himself that which he had hated, he penetrated that which he had abhorred. Henceforth he plainly perceived the providential, divine, and human sense of the great things which he had been taught to detest, and of the great men whom he had been instructed to curse. When he reflected on his former opinions, which were but those of yesterday, and which nevertheless seemed to him already so very ancient, he grew indignant, yet he smiled. From the rehabilitation of his father, he naturally passed to the rehabilitation of Napoleon. But the latter, we will confess, was not effected without labor. From his infancy, he had been imbued with the judgments of the party of 1814 on Bonaparte. Now, all the prejudices of the Restoration, all its interests, all its instincts tended to disfigure Napoleon. It execrated him even more than it did Robespierre. It had very cleverly turned to sufficiently good account the fatigue of the nation and the hatred of mothers. Bonaparte had become an almost fabulous monster, and in order to paint him to the imagination of the people, which, as we lately pointed out, resembles the imagination of children, the party of 1814 made him appear under all sorts of terrifying masks in succession, from that which is terrible, though it remains grandiose, to that which is terrible and becomes grotesque, from Tiberius to the bugaboo. Thus, in speaking of Bonaparte, one was free to sob or to puff up with laughter, provided that hatred lay at the bottom. Marius had never entertained about that man, as he was called, any other ideas in his mind. They had combined with the tenacity which existed in his nature. There was in him a headstrong little man who hated Napoleon. On reading history, on studying him, especially in the documents and materials for history, the veil which concealed Napoleon from the eyes of Marius was gradually rent. He caught a glimpse of something immense, and he suspected that he had been deceived up to that moment on the score of Bonaparte, as about all the rest. Each day he saw more distinctly, and he set about mounting slowly, step by step, almost regretfully in the beginning, then with intoxication and as though attracted by an irresistible fascination, first the somber steps, then the vaguely illuminated steps, at last the luminous and splendid steps of enthusiasm. One night he was alone in his little chamber near the roof. His candle was burning. He was reading with his elbows resting on his table close to the open window. All sorts of reveries reached him from space and mingled with his thoughts. What a spectacle is the night! One hears dull sounds without knowing whence they proceed. One beholds Jupiter, which is 1,200 times larger than the earth, glowing like a firebrand. The azure is black, the stars shine. It is formidable. He was perusing the bulletins of the Grand Army, those heroic strophes penned on the field of battle. There, at intervals, he beheld his father's name. Always the name of the Emperor. The whole of that great empire presented itself to him. He felt a flood swelling and rising within him. It seemed to him at moments that his father passed close to him like a breath and whispered in his ear. He gradually got into a singular state. He thought that he heard drums, cannon, trumpets, the measured tread of battalions, the dull and distant gallop of the cavalry. From time to time his eyes were raised heavenward and gazed upon the colossal constellations as they gleamed in the measureless depths of space. Then they fell upon his book once more, and there they beheld other colossal things moving confusedly. His heart contracted within him. He was in a transport, trembling, panting. All at once, without himself knowing what was in him and what impulse he was obeying, he sprang to his feet, stretched both arms out of the window, gazed intently into the gloom, the silence, the infinite darkness, the eternal immensity, and exclaimed, "Long live the Emperor!" From that moment forth, all was over. The ogre of Corsica, the usurper, the tyrant, the monster who was the lover of his own sisters, the actor who took lessons of Talma, the poisoner of Jaffa, the tiger, Bonaparte, all this vanished, and gave place in his mind to a vague and brilliant radiance in which shone at an inaccessible height the pale marble phantom of Cæsar. The emperor had been for his father only the well-beloved captain whom one admires, for whom one sacrifices oneself. He was something more to Marius. He was the predestined conductor of the French group, succeeding the Roman group in the domination of the universe. He was a prodigious architect of a destruction, the continuer of Charlemagne, of Louis XI, of Henri IV, of Richelieu, of Louis XIV, and of the Committee of Public Safety, having his spots, no doubt, his faults, his crimes even, being a man, that is to say, but august in his faults, brilliant in his spots, powerful in his crime. He was the predestined man who had forced all nations to say, the great nation. He was better than that. He was the very incarnation of France, conquering Europe by the sword which he grasped, and the world by the light which he shed. Marius saw in Bonaparte the dazzling spectre which will always rise upon the frontier, and which will guard the future. Despot but dictator, a despot resulting from a republic and summing up a revolution. Napoleon became for him the man-people, as Jesus Christ is the man-God. It will be perceived that like all new converts to a religion, his conversion intoxicated him. He hurled himself headlong into adhesion, and he went too far. His nature was so constructed, once on the downward slope, it was almost impossible for him to put on the drag. Fanaticism for the sword took possession of him, and complicated in his mind his enthusiasm for the idea. He did not perceive that along with genius and pell-mell he was admitting force, that is to say, that he was installing in two compartments of his idolatry, on the one hand that which is divine, on the other that which is brutal. In many respects he had set about deceiving himself otherwise. He admitted everything. There is a way of encountering error while on one's way to the truth. He had a violent sort of good faith which took everything in the lump. In the new path which he had entered on, in judging the mistakes of the old regime as in measuring the glory of Napoleon, he neglected the attenuating circumstances. At all events, a tremendous step had been taken. Where he had formerly beheld the fall of the monarchy, he now saw the advent of France. His orientation had changed. What had been his east became the west. He had turned squarely round. All these revolutions were accomplished within him, without his family obtaining an inkling of the case. When, during this mysterious labor, he had entirely shed his old Bourbon and ultra skin, when he had cast off the aristocrat, the Jacobite, and the royalist, when he had become thoroughly a revolutionist, profoundly democratic and republican, he went to an engraver on the Quai des Orfèvres and ordered 100 cards bearing this name, Le Baron Marius Pontmercy. This was only the strictly logical consequence of the change which had taken place in him, a change in which everything gravitated round his father. Only, as he did not know anyone and could not sow his cards with any porter, he put them in his pocket. By another natural consequence, in proportion as he drew nearer to his father, to the latter's memory, and to the things for which the colonel had fought 25 years before, he receded from his grandfather. We have long ago said that M. Gillenormand's temper did not please him. There already existed between them all the dissonances of the grave young man and the frivolous old man. The gaiety of Géronte shocks and exasperates the melancholy of Werther. So long as the same political opinions and the same ideas had been common to them both, Marius had met M. Gillenormand there as on a bridge. When the bridge fell, an abyss was formed. And then, over and above all, Marius experienced unutterable impulses to revolt. when he reflected that it was Monsieur Gillenormand who had, from stupid motives, torn him ruthlessly from the colonel, thus depriving the father of the child and the child of the father. By dint of pity for his father, Marius had nearly arrived at aversion for his grandfather. Nothing of this sort, however, was betrayed on the exterior, as we have already said. Only he grew colder and colder, laconic at meals and rare in the house. When his aunt scolded him for it, he was very gentle and alleged his studies, his lectures, the examinations, etc., as a pretext. His grandfather never departed from his infallible diagnosis. "In love, I know all about it." From time to time, Marius absented himself. "Where is it that he goes off like this?" said his aunt. On one of these trips, which were always very brief, he went to Montfermeil in order to obey the injunction which his father had left him, and he sought the old sergeant to Waterloo, the innkeeper Thénardier. Thénardier had failed, the inn was closed, and no one knew what had become of him. Marius was away from the house for 4 days on this quest. "He's getting decidedly wild," said his grandfather. They thought they had noticed that he wore something on his breast, under his shirt, which was attached to his neck by a black ribbon. End of Les Misérables, Volume 3, Book 3, Chapter 6. Book 3, The Grandfather and the Grandson. Chapter 7, Some Petticoat. We have mentioned a lancer. He was a great-grandnephew of Monsieur Gillenormand on the paternal side, who led a garrison life, outside the family and far from the domestic hearth. Lieutenant Théodule Gillenormand fulfilled all the conditions required to make what is called a fine officer. He had a lady's waist, a victorious manner of trailing his sword and of twirling his moustache in a hook. He visited Paris very rarely, and so rarely that Marius had never seen him. The cousins knew each other only by name. We think we have said that Théodule was the favorite of Aunt Gillenormand, who preferred him because she did not see him. Not seeing people permits one to attribute to them all possible perfections. One morning, Mademoiselle Gillenormand the elder returned to her apartment as much disturbed as her placidity was capable of allowing. Marius had just asked his grandfather's permission to take a little trip, adding that he meant to set out that very evening. "Go," had been his grandfather's reply. And Monsieur Gillenormand had added in an aside, as he raised his eyebrows to the top of his forehead, "Here he is, passing the night out again." Mademoiselle Gillenormand had ascended to her chamber greatly puzzled, and on the staircase had dropped this exclamation, "This is too much," and this interrogation, "But where is it that he goes?" She espied some adventure of the heart, more or less illicit, a woman in the shadow, a rendezvous, a mystery, and she would not have been sorry to thrust her spectacles into the affair. Tasting a mystery resembles getting the first flavor of a scandal. Sainted souls do not detest this. There is some curiosity about scandal in the secret compartments of bigotry. So she was the prey of a vague appetite for learning a history. In order to get rid of this curiosity, which agitated her a little beyond her wont, she took refuge in her talents and set about scalloping, one layer of cotton after another, one of those embroideries of the Empire and the Restoration, in which there are numerous cartwheels. The work was clumsy, the worker cross. She had been seated at this for several hours when the door opened. Mademoiselle Gillenormand raised her nose. Lieutenant Théodule stood before her, making the regulation salute. She uttered a cry of delight. One may be old, one may be a prude, one may be pious, one may be an aunt, but it is always agreeable to see a lancer enter one's chamber. "You there, Théodule!" she exclaimed. "On my way through town, aunt." "Embrace me." "Here goes," said Théodule, and he kissed her. Aunt Gillenormand went to her writing desk and opened it.
"You will remain with us a week at least?"
"I leave this very evening, aunt."
"It is not possible."
"Mathematically."
"Remain, my little Théodule, I beseech you."
"My heart says yes, but my orders say no. The matter is simple. They are changing our garrison. We have been in Melun. We are being transferred to Gaillon. It is necessary to pass through Paris in order to get from the old post to the new one. I said, I am going to see my aunt."
"Here is something for your trouble."
And she put 10 louis into his hand. "For my pleasure, you mean to say, my dear aunt." Théodule kissed her again, and she experienced the joy of having some of the skin scratched from her neck by the braidings on his uniform.
"Are you making the journey on horseback with your regiment?"
she asked him. "No, aunt. I wanted to see you. I have special permission. My servant is taking my horse. I am traveling by diligence. And, by the way, I want to ask you something."
"What is it?"
"Is my cousin Marius Pontmercy traveling so too?"
"How do you know that?"
said his aunt, suddenly pricked to the quick with a lively curiosity. "On my arrival, I went to the diligence to engage my seat in the coupe."
"Well?"
"A traveller had already come to engage a seat in the Imperial. I saw his name on the card."
"What name?"
"Marius Pontmercy."
"The wicked fellow!" exclaimed his aunt. "Ah, your cousin is not a steady lad like yourself. To think that he is to pass the night in a diligence!"
"Just as I am going to do."
"But you, it is your duty. In his case, it is wildness."
"Bosh!" said Théodule. Here an event occurred to Mademoiselle Gillenormand the elder. An idea struck her. If she had been a man, she would have slapped her brow. She apostrophized Théodule.
"Are you aware whether your cousin knows you?"
"No, I have seen him, but he has never deigned to notice me."
"So you are going to travel together?"
"He in the Imperial, I in the coupe."
"Where does this diligence run?"
"To Andelys."
"Then that is where Marius is going."
"Unless, like myself, he should stop on the way. I get down at Vernon in order to take the branch coach to Gaillon. I know nothing of Marius' plan of travel."
"Marius, what an ugly name! What possessed them to name him Marius, while you at least are called Théodule?"
"I would rather be called Alfred," said the officer.
"Listen, Théodule."
"I am listening, aunt."
"Pay attention."
"I am paying attention."
"You understand?"
"Yes."
"Well, Marius absents himself."
Ah.
"He travels."
Ah.
"He spends the night out."
Oh.
"We should like to know what there is behind all this."
Théodule replied with the composure of a man of bronze. "Some petticoat or other." And with that inward laugh which denotes certainty, he added, "Alas!"
"That is evident,"
exclaimed his aunt, who thought she heard Monsieur Gillenormand speaking, and who felt her conviction become irresistible at that word fillet, accentuated in almost the very same fashion by the granduncle and the grandnephew. She resumed,
"Do us a favor. Follow Marius a little. He does not know you. It will be easy. Since a lass there is, try to get a sight of her. You must write us the tale. It will amuse your grandfather."
Théodule had no excessive taste for this sort of spying, but he was much touched by the 10 louis, and he thought he saw a chance for a possible sequel. He accepted the commission and said, "As you please, aunt." And he added in an aside to himself, "Here I am a duenna." Mademoiselle Gillenormand embraced him. "You are not the man to play such pranks, Théodule. You obey discipline. You are the slave of orders. You are a man of scruples and duty. You would not quit your family to go and see a creature." The lancer made the pleased grimace of a cartouche when praised for his probity. Marius, on the evening following this dialogue, mounted the diligence without suspecting that he was watched. As for the watcher, the first thing he did was to fall asleep. His slumber was complete and conscientious. Argus ignored all night long. At daybreak, the conductor of the diligence shouted, "Vernon, relay of Vernon, travelers for Vernon," and Lieutenant Théodule woke. "Good," he growled, still half asleep. "This is where I get out." Then, as his memory cleared by degrees the effect of waking, he recalled his aunt, the 10 louis, and the account which he had undertaken to render of the deeds and proceedings of Marius. This set him to laughing. Perhaps he is no longer in the coach, he thought, as he rebuttoned the waistcoat of his undress uniform. He may have stopped at Poissy. He may have stopped at Triel. If he did not get out at Moulins, he may have got out at Mantes, unless he got out at Rolleboise, or if he did not go on as far as Passy, with the choice of turning to the left at Évreus or to the right at La Roche-Guyon. Run after him, auntie. What the devil am I to write to that good old soul? At that moment, a pair of black trousers descending from the Imperial made its appearance at the window of the coupe. "Can that be Marius?" said the lieutenant. It was Marius. A little peasant girl, all entangled with the horses and the postilions at the end of the vehicle, was offering flowers to the travelers. "Give your ladies flowers," she cried. Marius approached her and purchased the finest flowers in her flat basket. "Come now," said Théodule, leaping down from the coupe. "This piques my curiosity. Who the deuce is he going to carry those flowers to? She must be a splendidly handsome woman for so fine a bouquet. I want to see her." And no longer in pursuance of orders, but from personal curiosity, like dogs who hunt on their own account, he set out to follow Marius. Marius paid no attention to Théodule. Elegant women descended from the diligence. He did not glance at them. He seemed to see nothing around him. "He is pretty deeply in love," thought Théodule. Marius directed his steps towards the church. "Capital," said Théodule to himself. "Rendezvous seasoned with a bit of mass are the best sort. Nothing is so exquisite as an ogle which passes over the good God's head." On arriving at the church, Marius did not enter it, but skirted the apse. He disappeared behind one of the angles of the apse. "The rendezvous is appointed outside," said Théodule. "Let's have a look at the lass." And he advanced on the tips of his boots toward the corner where Marius had turned. On arriving there, he halted in amazement. Marius, with his forehead clasped in his hands, was kneeling upon the grass on a grave. He had strewn his bouquet there. At the extremity of the grave, on a little swelling which marked the head, there stood a cross of black wood, with this name in white letters: Colonel Baron Pontmercy. Marius' sobs were audible. The lass was a grave. End of Book 3, Chapter 7. Chapter 7. Chapter 7.
Book 3, The Grandfather and the Grandson. Chapter 8, Marble against Granite. It was hither that Marius had come on the first occasion of his absenting himself from Paris. It was hither that he had come every time that M. Gillenormand had said, "He's sleeping out." Lieutenant Théodule was absolutely put out of countenance by this unexpected encounter with a sepulchre. He experienced a singular and disagreeable sensation which he was incapable of analyzing, and which was composed of respect for the tomb mingled with respect for the colonel. He retreated, leaving Marius alone in the cemetery, and there was discipline in this retreat. Death appeared to him with large epaulets, and he almost made the military salute to him. Not knowing what to write to his aunt, he decided not to write at all, and it is probable that nothing would have resulted from the discovery made by Théodule as to the love affairs of Marius, if, by one of those mysterious arrangements which are so frequent in chance, the scene at Vernon had not had an almost immediate countershock at Paris. Marius returned from Vernon on the third day, in the middle of the morning, descended at his grandfather's door, and, wearied by the 2 nights spent in the diligence, and feeling the need of repairing his loss of sleep by an hour at the swimming school, he mounted rapidly to his chamber, took merely time enough to throw off his travelling coat and the black ribbon which he wore round his neck, and went off to the bath. Monsieur Gillenormand, who had risen betimes like all old men in good health, had heard his entrance, and had made haste to climb, as quickly as his old legs permitted, the stairs to the upper story where Marius lived, in order to embrace him and to question him while so doing, and to find out where he had been. But the youth had taken less time to descend than the old man had to ascend, and when Father Gillenormand entered the attic, Marius was no longer there. The bed had not been disturbed, and on the bed lay, outspread but not defiantly, the greatcoat and the black ribbon. "I like this better," said Monsieur Gillenormand. And a moment later he made his entrance into the salon, where Mademoiselle Gillenormand was already seated, busily embroidering her cartwheels. The entrance was a triumphant one. Monsieur Gillenormand held in one hand the greatcoat and in the other the neck ribbon, and exclaimed, "Victory! We are about to penetrate the mystery. We are going to learn the most minute details. We are going to lay our finger on the debaucheries of our sly friend. Here we have the romance itself. I have the portrait." In fact, a case of black shagreen, resembling a medallion portrait, was suspended from the ribbon. The old man took this case and gazed at it for some time without opening it, with that air of enjoyment, rapture, and wrath, with which a poor hungry fellow beholds an admirable dinner, which is not for him, pass under his very nose. "For this evidently is a portrait. I know all about such things. That is worn tenderly on the heart. How stupid they are! Some abominable fright that will make us shudder, probably. Young men have such bad taste nowadays." "Let us see, father," said the old spinster. The case opened by the pressure of a spring. They found in it nothing but a carefully folded paper. "From the same to the same," said Monsieur Gillenormand, bursting with laughter. "I know what it is, a billet doux." "Ah, let us read it," said the aunt, and she put on her spectacles. They unfolded the paper and read as follows: "For my son, the Emperor made me a baron on the battlefield of Waterloo. Since the Restoration disputes my right to this title, which I purchased with my blood, my son shall take it and bear it. That he will be worthy of it is a matter of course." The feelings of father and daughter cannot be described. They felt chilled, as by the breath of a death's head. They did not exchange a word. Only Monsieur Gillenormand said in a low voice, and as though speaking to himself, "It is the slasher's handwriting." The aunt examined the paper, turned it about in all directions, then put it back in its case. At the same moment, a little oblong packet, enveloped in blue paper, fell from one of the pockets of the greatcoat. Mademoiselle Gillenormand picked it up and unfolded the blue paper. It contained Marius's 100 cards. She handed one of them to Monsieur Gillenormand, who read, "Le Baron Marius Pontmercy." The old man rang the bell. Nicolette came. Monsieur Gillenormand took the ribbon, the case, and the coat, flung them all on the floor in the middle of the room, and said, "Carry those duds away." A full hour passed in the most profound silence. The old man and the old spinster had seated themselves with their backs to each other, and were thinking, each on his own account, the same things in all probability. At the expiration of this hour, Aunt Gillenormand said, "A pretty state of things." A few moments later, Marius made his appearance. He entered. Even before he had crossed the threshold, he saw his grandfather holding one of his own cards in his hand, and on catching sight of him, the latter exclaimed with his air of bourgeois and grinning superiority, which was something crushing, "Well, well, 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 so you are a baron now. I present you my compliments. What is the meaning of this?" Marius reddened slightly and replied, "It means that I am the son of my father." Monsieur Gillenormand ceased to laugh, and said harshly, "I am your father." "My father," retorted Marius, with downcast eyes and a severe air, "was a humble and heroic man, who served the Republic and France gloriously, who was great in the greatest history that men have ever made, who lived in the bivouac for a quarter of a century, beneath grape-shot and bullets, in snow and mud by day, beneath rain at night, who captured 2 flags, who received 20 wounds, who died forgotten and abandoned, and who never committed but one mistake, which was to love too fondly 2 ingrates, his country and myself." This was more than Monsieur Gillenormand could bear to hear. At the word republic, he rose, or to speak more correctly, he sprang to his feet. Every word that Marius had just uttered produced on the visage of the old royalist the effect of the puffs of air from a forge upon a blazing brand. From a dull hue he had turned red, from red, purple, and from purple, flame-colored. "Marius," he cried, "abominable child! I do not know what your father was. I do not wish to know. I know nothing about that, and I do not know him. But what I do know is that there never was anything but scoundrels among those men. They were all rascals, assassins, redcaps, thieves. I say all. I say all. I know not one. I say all. Do you hear me, Marius? See here, you are no more a baron than my slipper is. They were all bandits in the service of Robespierre. All who served Buonaparte were brigands. They were all traitors who betrayed their legitimate king. All cowards who flew before the Prussians and the English at Waterloo. That is what I do know. Whether monsieur your father comes in that category, I do not know. I am sorry for it, so much the worse, your humble servant." In his turn, it was Marius who was the firebrand, and Monsieur Gillenormand who was the bellows. Marius quivered in every limb. He did not know what would happen next. His brain was on fire. He was the priest who beholds all his sacred wafers cast to the winds, the faker who beholds a passer-by spit upon his idol. It could not be that such things had been uttered in his presence. What was he to do? His father had just been trampled underfoot and stamped upon in his presence. But by whom? By his grandfather. How was he to avenge the one without outraging the other? It was impossible for him to insult his grandfather, and it was equally impossible for him to leave his father unavenged. On the one hand was a sacred grave, on the other hoary locks. He stood there for several moments, staggering as though intoxicated, with all this whirlwind dashing through his head. Then he raised his eyes, gazed fixedly at his grandfather, and cried in a voice of thunder, "Down with the Bourbons and that great hog of a Louis XVIII." Louis XVIII had been dead for 4 years, but it was all the same to him. The old man, who had been crimson, turned whiter than his hair. He wheeled round towards a bust of Monsieur le Duc de Berry, which stood on the chimney-piece, and made a profound bow, with a sort of peculiar majesty. Then he paced twice, slowly and in silence, from the fireplace to the window, and from the window to the fireplace, traversing the whole length of the room, and making the polished floor creak as though he had been a stone statue walking. On his second turn, he bent over his daughter, who was watching this encounter with the stupefied air of an antiquated lamb, and said to her with a smile that was almost calm, A baron like this gentleman and a bourgeois like myself cannot remain under the same roof." And drawing himself up all at once, pallid, trembling, terrible, with his brow rendered more lofty by the terrible radiance of wrath, he extended his arm towards Marius and shouted to him, "Be off!" Marius left the house. On the following day, M. Gillenormand said to his daughter, "You will send 60 pistoles every 6 months to that blood drinker, and you will never mention his name to me." Having an immense reserve fund of wrath to get rid of, and not knowing what to do with it, he continued to address his daughter as you instead of thou for the next 3 months. Marius, on his side, had gone forth in indignation. There was one circumstance which, it must be admitted, aggravated his exasperation. There are always petty fatalities of the sort which complicate domestic dramas. They augment the grievances in such cases, although, in reality, the wrongs are not increased by them. While carrying Marius's duds precipitately to his chamber, at his grandfather's command, Nicolette had inadvertently let fall, probably, on the attic staircase, which was dark, that medallion of black shagreen which contained the paper penned by the colonel. Neither paper nor case could afterwards be found. Marius was convinced that M. Gillenormand, from that day forth he never alluded to him otherwise, had flung his father's testament in the fire. He knew by heart the few lines which the colonel had written, and consequently nothing was lost, but the paper, the writing, that sacred relic, all that was his very heart. What had been done with it? Marius had taken his departure without saying whither he was going, and without knowing where, with 30 francs, his watch, and a few clothes in a handbag. He had entered a hackney coach, had engaged it by the hour, and had directed his course at haphazard towards the Latin Quarter. What was to become of Marius? End of Book 3, Chapter 8.